G'day, May 40 here. It's a hard thing to ask individuals, let alone communities and nations and peoples, to act against their own self-interest. So, is China stronger for the presence of millions of Uyghurs who hate it? Obviously not. In Sri Lanka, it's been fighting wars against Tamil terrorist guerrillas. Is Sri Lanka stronger for containing Tamils who absolutely hate Sri Lanka? No, obviously it's not. Is Israel stronger because it has millions of Arabs under its power who are either citizens of Israel or in occupied territories in the West Bank or Gaza? No, Israel is not stronger for the presence of people who don't identify or feel sympathy for the Jewish state. And think about what goes on between workers and employers. Employers are incentivized to extract as much work as possible from their employees while paying them as little as possible. Employees are incentivized to do as little effort as possible while extracting as much income as possible. So how do you overcome these incentives that operate in a way that's against, say, conventional wisdom, against the public morality? So one way that employers may try to incentivize employees is by giving them a sense of ownership, by making the work rewarding, making them feel invested in the company. And I know I can get lost in my work and just go beyond breaks and lunch hours and just go when I'm fully absorbed, when I love my job. All right, I am a work-seeking missile. And Israel, the establishment of the Jewish state, the establishers of the Jewish state in 1947-48, they tried to drive the Arabs out of Israel. They're only prevented from completely doing so by international attention, particularly around the area of Bethlehem and the origins of Christianity. So international attention and international pressure forced the founders of the State of Israel to not expel all of its Arabs. Now, it is a dream among many right-wing Jews to expel Arabs out of Gaza and the West Bank to create a greater Israel, a stronger Israel. And obviously, Israel would be stronger and more cohesive if it could expel Arabs out of Gaza and the West Bank. If it could do so without bringing down just a mountain of international pressure. And Donald Trump is a dream for many of these nationalist Jews. So we see headlines all over the media today. Trump says he wants to clean out Gaza, send refugees to Egypt and Jordan. President said the move could be temporary or long-term. Israel would love this to happen, right? They may say it is temporary, but they would long for this to be permanent. Why would Israel want to have millions of Arabs in its midst who are not big fans of the Jewish state? So this is the Wall Street Journal. President Trump says he wants to clean out the Gaza Strip. He urged Jordan and Egypt to take in refugees either temporarily or for the long term, a move that's been rejected by Arab countries since the war began. Why would Arab countries reject this? One, no country has been able to build a plausible case that it is benefited from an influx of Palestinian refugees. They've caused major dislocation wherever they've gone. They don't have a track record of building up societies and contributing. They have a track record of causing massive division. And Arab countries don't want to accede to the Jewish state. They don't want to reward the creation of a Jewish state in their midst. And they don't want to just give up on acceptance of the Jewish state. So President Trump told reporters on Air Force One Saturday, you're talking about 1.5 million people. We just clean out that whole thing. Over the centuries, it has had many, many conflicts. Something has to happen. And this is the Jewish dream, because there are so many Arab states, so many Muslim states surrounding Israel. Why not just incorporate the Palestinians into an existing Arab Muslim state where they will get to share the same religion, the same language, the same customs, the same ethnic, racial, biological heritage? All right. There are many reasons to believe that they could eventually contribute to Jordan or to Egypt, though Jordan and Egypt don't want that right now because the track record of Palestinians is so bad. Now, Jordan says absolutely no. Egypt says absolutely no. Egypt has its own problems with Muslim extremism. Jordan had its own problems with Arab terrorism. And so they're not big fans of taking in Palestinians. Palestinians fear that if they leave Gaza, Israel will never allow them to return. That's a very accurate fear. There are millions of Palestinian refugees scattered mostly in Arab countries since Israel's founding in 1948. Their future has been at the heart of the conflict. And so the land that currently constitutes the Jewish state of Israel, right? Jews can make claims to that land that go back thousands of years, but Arabs can make claims to that land that go back hundreds of years. So 140 years ago, about 90% of the population of the current land that constitutes the Jewish state of Israel was occupied by Arabs. So Arabs have a great case to make that this is our land. They were the overwhelming majority in this area for centuries. So they don't want to give up the land. On the other hand, right, their presence in Gaza, their presence in the West Bank is a thorn in Israel's side. It's hard to imagine Israel acceding to a Palestinian state at this point. And so if Trump could provide enough incentives to make this happen, right, that would be a phenomenal accomplishment towards Middle East peace. Once again, Trump is saying the quiet part out loud. Let's get a news update here from Fox.
Hundreds of suspected criminals and deploying troops to the border. Are officials down there finally feeling supported? We'll talk to one.
And 4 more Israeli hostages reunited with their families this weekend as the ceasefire deal with Hamas seems to be holding just about. But is Israel's deal with Lebanon cracking? Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, is here.
Plus, more of Trump's cabinet picks facing Senate hearings this week, the fireworks that could be coming, and the warning North Korea is sending to the United States after its latest missile test.
Good morning. As Howie Kurtz posted this morning, he's battling a case of pneumonia and hopes to be back soon. We hope so too. We love you, Howie. Welcome to Fox News Live. In the meantime, I'm Jonathan Hunt in Los Angeles. Hello, Alicia.
Hi, Jonathan. Good to see you, and we do wish our best to Howie. I'm in Denver, and we do start with C.B. Cotton in New York with the latest on those ICE arrests we're seeing all across the nation. C.B.
Hi, Alicia. Yeah, the new administration continues to carry out its promise of mass deportations. And a senior Trump administration official has just told our colleague Bill Malugin about more results from this effort, telling him that 2 men with ties to the violent Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua were taken into custody in Nashville, Tennessee, and another in San Antonio, Texas. The senior official says all 3 men were previously caught and then released at the border during.
So I think it was the summer of 1982 or 1983 when I first encountered on TV news pronunciations of foreign capitals not in the English language. So you would hear someone speaking with a normal American accent, but then they say Nicaragua. It was stunning. It was off-putting. It was jarring, right? If you're going to be speaking to an English language audience, why would you not want to use English language pronunciation? But it was a way of, I guess, distinguishing yourself from the hoi polloi, showing that you are smarter, wiser, you're better than everyone else. So you'll go along using standard English language American pronunciation for an American TV news report, but then when it comes to foreign capitals, you suddenly use a different language pronunciation. It's so bizarre to an American ear. You suddenly change the basis for your pronunciation, and it's just a way of showing, how much more sophisticated and morally upright and elevated you are compared to your audience.
During the Biden administration, President Trump, he spoke about this gang just yesterday and made another promise.
Heroes of ICE have been hunting down and arresting hundreds of illegal alien criminals. And its immediate expulsion, including those with charges of convictions for rape, child sexual assault, terrorism, and even murder, members of the savage Venezuelan prison gang known as Tren de Aragua, that all over the place. We'll get them out. We'll get them out.
And speaking of getting them out, this week our Bill Melugin was there as ICE agents in Boston arrested 8 people, all in the country illegally and wanted for a wide range of crimes. Also this week, our Alexis McAdams learned from a senior Trump administration official that in New York, ICE arrested a man who they say is a known or suspected terrorist. Officials say he is from Turkey and entered the country illegally. This week, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt shared these photos on X of a plane taking 80 Guatemalan nationals back to their home countries after officials say they crossed into the U.S. illegally. So get this, in a single day this week, ICE reported making more than 500 arrests. Alicia.
Wow, things are really moving. CB Cotton live in New York. Good to see you. Thank you. Jonathan.
Alicia, so how are officials in border cities reacting to all of this? Joining us now, the Republican mayor of McAllen, Texas, Javier Villalobos. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for being here. And simply put, how do you think the Trump administration is handling these early days of the crackdown?
So you may have heard about AI, and you may have heard about facial recognition. So we have made vast improvements with facial recognition and other forms of technology that could dramatically aid the Trump administration if it wants to deploy this new tech to find, locate, and remove people who are in the country illegally. Right? New York Times article, the tech arsenal that could power Trump's immigration crackdown. We have an arsenal at our disposal if we want to use it. Right? We can use AI. We can use facial recognition. We can use all sorts of people tracking software to locate people in the country illegally, particularly those who've committed other crimes aside from being in the country illegally. But we can find them and deport them. So we have already spent billions of dollars assembling surveillance tools to track and to find people, right? And we can use them, right? We've got apps. We've got ankle monitors that track asylum seekers in real time. We've got databases packed with personal information, such as fingerprints and faces. We've got all sorts of investigative tools that can break into locked phones. We can search through gigabytes of emails, text messages, and other files. So AI search of data is increasingly huge, right? It's far more efficient way of finding things through vast amounts of data than just assigning individuals to look through the data. Right. So Donald Trump has a technological arsenal available to him. And if he wants to crack down on illegal immigration, if he wants to carry out the largest deportation in American history, he can do it. He can build on this stockpile of tools built up by Democrats and Republicans that is unmatched in the Western world. Right. There are 2 agencies, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Citizen and Immigration Services, that have spent $8 billion on immigration technology since 2020. Right, most of these contracts were initiated under the Biden administration. So we have tools that rapidly prove family relationships with a DNA test. So you can check whether an adult migrant crossing the border with a minor, if they're indeed related. We can compare biometrics against criminal records. We can alert agents to changes in address. We can follow cars with license plate readers. And we can rip and analyze data from phones, hard drives, cars, and from facial recognition. We've got companies such as Palantir, that was founded by Peter Thiel. It's received more than $1 billion over the past 4 years. We've got Verntel, provider of location data. It has had 7 contracts with ICE in the last few years. So we can find, locate, and deport illegals if we have the will. So how will the Trump administration use these tools? Right, we've got the tech products to locate people in the country illegally. Right, we can use all tools at our disposal if we want to. So we've got Clearview AI, a facial recognition firm, has contracts worth millions. We've got Cellebrite, an Israeli phone cracking company, sold ICE about $54 million in investigative tools. Right, the FBI used Cellebrite in 2016 to unlock the iPhone of the mass shooter in San Bernardino, California. and investors have taken note. So you've got the stock price at Geo Group, a private prison operator that sells monitoring technology to ICE. Its shares have more than doubled since Donald Trump won November's election. Celebrite shares have doubled in the past 6 months. Palantir's shares have risen about 80%. All right, we've got 180,000 undocumented immigrants, illegal aliens, who wear an ankle bracelet with a GPS tracking device, or they use an app called SmartLink that requires them to log their whereabouts at least once a day. So we know where they are. And so it should be pretty easy to locate people, right? If we want to scale up detention and deporting, we've got the tools to do it. We also have access to private databases with biometrics, addresses, and criminal records. ICE agents can find the utility bills for 3/4 of Americans. They have access to driver's licenses for about 1/3 of Americans. So we can track people high on ICE's priority list, such as those with a criminal history or people who do not show up for immigration court hearings. We can use these databases to find someone's automobile information, use license plate readers to pinpoint their location. So we've got the tools to crack down on these illegal immigrants.
Would require an actual constitutional amendment. Many, of course, have claimed that the 14th Amendment is clear, that this obviously would require an amendment to the Constitution in order to say that undocumented, the children of illegal immigrants here are citizens. But the argument that the Trump administration is making is that it does not, in fact, require an amendment, and it's simply an interpretation question that the Supreme Court has not directly addressed. So certainly, I think it's very important, the incentives that come from the idea of coming here and simply getting citizenship, regardless of the status of your parents, is a big deal in the immigration realm, of course. But whether the Constitution requires it as written.
Constitution, it's a great document. We should respect the Constitution. But there's something even more important than the Constitution. That is the safety and the prosperity and the cohesion and the levels of social trust of the American people. The Constitution should not be a death warrant. We should not allow people to be in the country illegally and then grant their children automatic citizenship just because they were born in America. We should not allow people coming here on a visa and then having children in America and then automatically granting those children citizenship. Birthright citizenship is terrible for the United States of America. We got to find a way to nullify it.
Is not determined as of yet.
And this would impact, estimates are around 150,000 children every year are born to women who are not U.S. citizens. But what's interesting, regardless of where this goes with this particular fight, this does open up the conversation in a lot of corners in the United States where people hadn't really been talking about this that much other than the campaign trail.
Starting conversations, opening up conversations. I just want to have a dialogue. That used to really rub me the wrong way when people on the left would do it. I'm blanking now on the cliche ways, but we should have a conversation about that. You often hear that from bosses, employers, people in charge, and it just didn't ring true. But even if Donald Trump doesn't overturn birthright citizenship, it feels good to me that we're at least we're having a conversation about it. And it feels good to me that at least we're having a conversation about expelling the Arabs out of Gaza. So I used to just mock all this left-wing veneration of we should have a dialogue, we should have a conversation about this or that. But now I suddenly find that I love the idea.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think that we have to look at the big picture of why people obviously want to come here. The benefits of being an American citizen are enormous, and the money and cost that goes into that for American taxpayers is also enormous. So certainly it's understandable why people would want to pursue fighting for this and retaining those benefits. But the question of whether we actually recognize that as part of a constitutional guarantee is a whole other conversation. Big picture, though.
So in case you're wondering, I strongly support deporting everybody in this country illegally, including all DACA recipients, right? I want everyone deported, and you'd only have to deport 5% of them, and the other 95% will voluntarily self-deport. So for every one person you physically deport, right, another 20 approximately will self-deport. So we need to create strong incentives for people to leave this country, to self-deport if they are here illegally.
I think it just highlights how important it is to cut off at the pass here any people coming in here for birth tourism purposes and to take advantage of this so-called birthright citizenship realm. But I mean, if we have to take in people endlessly and supply benefits, that's going to be something that's not sustainable in the long run. And I think that's the point that the Trump administration is making here.
And you heard the president there talking about the judge in this. And, you know, he always has that kind of rhetoric when he's in any kind of battle. Do you think that helps, hurts? Does it even matter?
Well, I think that he knows that this case was going to hopefully go up to the Supreme Court ultimately, and that there was no chance at the lower levels that the executive order would be upheld. And of course, the injunctions issued are important because there is going to be irreparable harm to people that don't get recognized as citizens if this is upheld before the case is fully adjudicated. So certainly, I don't think it was a surprise that the courts at these lower levels in the states that these lawsuits were filed are going to put a stop to this. So
I favor the exact same type of immigration policy for the United States as for Israel, as for France, as for Germany, as for England. I would want Germany, France, England, Holland, Spain, Italy, Israel. All right, I want them all to have the ability to deport the illegal aliens, the invaders in their midst. Let's do it. All right, looking at the chat. As long as there is Zionism in Israel, there will never be peace, ever. Well, I agree. As long as there are people with different gifts and different loyalties and different interests, there will never be peace. There will never be peace as long as there's Israel. There will never be peace as long as there is not Israel. There will never be peace on earth because human desires are infinite, natural resources are limited, and different groups have different interests. So, yes, I agree. There will always be profound conflicts of interest, just as if you have friends, do you have friends, right? There will never be a time when you and your friend have zero conflicts of interest. There will never be a time when you and your spouse have zero conflicts of interest. There will never be a time when you and your child have zero conflicts of interest. Right? To live with other people is to be constantly negotiating, right, our own priorities and how they mesh with the priorities of people who are most important to us. And when are we willing to give up on what's particularly important to us? Because, for example, our relationship with someone else might be more important. If we give too much of what we prioritize, right, other people will lose respect for us. If we are completely inflexible, we will be unable to develop relationships. And yet, other people are our greatest source of energy. Yesterday, a beautiful young woman told me, "You're looking sharp." And I'm still riding high. Okay, I'm going to do hours of live streaming on the energy, the strength, the enthusiasm, the power that I receive from that simple compliment. The beautiful compliments that people have given me over the years, they still sometimes ring in my ears. They're a never-ending source of optimism. And without optimism, it's really hard to have energy and strength and determination and enthusiasm to get anything done. You can have such a profound effect on somebody's life with a sincere compliment. I remember the first weekend that I met Dennis Prager, I believe it was the end of January 1994. And at the end of our conversation, Dennis Prager was driving away when he motioned me over, and he said, if you come to Los Angeles, I might have work for you. And he also said, it gives me inner peace knowing that if something were to happen to me, that there would be people like you who will carry on the fight for good values. I've never forgotten that.
In the short term, but long term, this is something on the constitutional side of things that has really never been thoroughly analyzed to this extent. So I think the court will weigh in. It's going to be an uphill battle to, I think, convince the court that the 14th Amendment does not require recognition of birthright citizenship for children of illegal immigrants, but it's not an impossible task.
Interesting. Okay, Katie Cherkasky, so good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get back to the stimulating chat. Supreme Court's going to rule on birthright citizenship. Buckle up. Blaming certain ethnicity and immigrants, rounding people up for deportation. Sounds more like Nazi Germany, not any sort of free democracy nonsense. So, Brett Boyle, do you loathe the United States of America? You had the creation of the United States of America in large part by the deporting of Tories. Right? Those who supported England were pushed out of the United States. They went to Canada or they went back to England. In fact, there are very few nation states that have been created without expelling some people. You have the origins of Pakistan came out of a massive civil war between India and Pakistan where close to 1 million people died and about 10 million people were deported or moved from one country to another. Israel would have to go to war with Egypt to ethnically cleanse Gaza, or Israel may be able to create conditions and incentives that would perhaps incentivize people to leave Gaza. Trump's request is just a sign to appease Jewish donors and friends before capitulating. If we return to the original state when the war started, when Israel had a plan to invade Egypt to expel the Gazans to the Sinai Peninsula. Another comment, Palestine should have refused the illegal immigration of Zionists from 1933 to 1948. Palestine was never an independent state, so Palestine did not have the ability to refuse or to do anything. It's like saying the Indians should have refused the illegal immigration of Puritans in the 1612s or the 1610s. And they wouldn't have the problems of being wiped off the map today, right? Indians didn't get a choice in the immigration of the Puritans. The Indians did everything they could to wipe out the Puritans, and the only reason the Indians didn't wipe out the Puritans was because they couldn't wipe out the Puritans. The only reason the Arabs didn't wipe out the Jews and the Jewish state in 1948 is because they couldn't. They weren't strong enough. In the end, the strong take what they want, and the weak endure what they must. I would rather be strong. There's no incentive that Trump can give Egypt to take Gazan refugees. It can only be done by invading the Sinai Peninsula and forcing them there. You're probably right. I find it impossible to believe that Egypt or Jordan would voluntarily accept Gazans. Dennis Prager is a Zionist propagandist. Yeah, that's fair. The U.S. and Canada were created on and born out of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Yes. Never again is supposed to be for everyone, not just one group. Well, name me any state that was not created by ethnic cleansing and genocide. Right? You got Australia today. It came out of ethnic cleansing and genocide of the original inhabitants. The indigenous populations absolutely should have sent back the white Europeans for sure. For their own interests, they should have done that. Why didn't they do that? Because they were not strong enough. They were not smart enough. They were not capable enough. They did their best and they failed. We have the return of the conqueror mindset. I assume that Jordan has had enough of Palestinian migrants already. Well, maybe if they just set up more education camps and teach them about the glories of Jordanian nationalism and how to live in peace with each other, right? Maybe then Palestinian refugees will become a blessing to Jordan. Look, I've got some tough talk for Jordan. Jordan is going to have to learn to be multicultural. If Jordan does not become multicultural, it will not survive. Jews are going to play a leading role in making Jordan multicultural, and for that, we will be resented. But without the embrace of multiculturalism, Jordan is not going to survive. The US, the UK, and Germany all protected the Zionist invaders, made sure that they were well armed, and ensured that the Arabs were divided and broken. That was the purpose of World War I. Right? If you think that was the primary purpose or the secondary purpose of World War I don't think that's accurate. Zionists started earlier than the Palestinians, right? And they organized more effectively. They lobbied more effectively. They enlisted cooperation with bigger powers more effectively than the Arabs. And because they were more effective and they operated in a hierarchy, more cohesive way, they won. Perhaps Jordan should set up some midnight basketball programs for Palestinian refugees. Maybe if Israel weren't ethnically cleansing Palestine, there wouldn't be Palestinian refugees. Yes, I get that. The establishment of one state in a crowded area where different peoples are competing for a particular land will almost always create ethnic cleansing. I just don't know how you would carve out one state when the land on that state is contested and different peoples who hate each other are fighting for control of that land. I don't see how you'll have the establishment of any independent state there without ethnic cleansing. You had the establishment of Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, right, all came about because of ethnic cleansing. So because ethnic cleansing and genocide happened in the past, you're using it as an excuse that it's okay for Israel to ethnically cleanse. I haven't said anything about what's moral here. I've only talked to you about how the world works. Ideally, we would all love each other and live together in peace and harmony. Zionism started in the late 1890s. Zionism and Israel is also extremism, which goes against Judaism. That is a perspective within Judaism. It's not the majority perspective. Zionists were simply more effective than the Palestinians at organizing their own state. Just as George Soros and the DAs he's elected have been more effective than their conservative opposition. So instead of whining about George Soros, I think it's much more important to understand, like, why was George Soros so effective? Why were the Zionists so effective? Why is the Israel lobby so effective? But what I'm sharing is the mindset of a winner, right? You may prefer to be the righteous loser, right? You're not primarily about winning. You're primarily about feeling righteous. There is a biochemical rush that comes from feeling victimized. And I got addicted to that rush in my childhood. I remember when we returned to Avondale College, which is in New South Wales, in something like December of 1972. So I believe we were in Munich pretty much around the time of the 1972 Munich Olympics. So late August, early September. We were certainly in Europe at that time. And then we returned to Avondale College, which is a Seventh-day Adventist college outside of Sydney. And I was an unhappy kid. And when people would look at me, they thought I looked like a Holocaust survivor. My father had remarried about 18 months previous, and it was not going well. And I was just miserable. And I got addicted to the power of making other people miserable. And so there were two times when I even tried to set fires in the bush outside my home because I wanted the rest of the community to feel as miserable as I felt on the inside. And I learned how much misery I could inflict on other people by being miserable and choosing to stay miserable. And I remember developing an addiction to that biochemical rush of feeling miserable and seeing how much that hurt my parents. And there's something called normal marital sadism, but it would also apply to our friendships. We often will get a biochemical rush from making the people we love the most hurt. Human relationships are complicated, and normal marital sadism refers to the sadism that we engage in as a matter of course, that we often delight in causing pain to those that we love the most. because there's a biological, biochemical rush that comes with causing this pain. I don't need you to explain anything to me. The JDL called me the teacher for reasons. I didn't know the JDL called you Jewish Defense League, called you the teacher. The Palestinians aren't going anywhere. Israel causing mass waves of migration is a myth. Syrians are going home just like the Iraqis did after Saddam. That was one of Kevin Michael Grace's greatest analyses of foreign policy and immigration. If you get involved on their end, the end result is they come here. I think Steve Saylor first developed that idea with invade the world, invite the world. When you invade the world, then the world ends up immigrating here. Yeah, how is Judaism against extremism? I've been at war with the JDL for years. They try to get me thrown in jail. They have their own name for me, the teacher. I teach people about Israel. I have studied it for decades, says Brett Boyle. Using previous ethnic cleansing and genocide to justify ethnic cleansing and genocide today is not good. It is also against the law to feasibly seize and steal land by force. Okay, so I haven't been making any moral arguments here, so I don't know, Brett Boyle, who you're arguing with, but it's not with me. I haven't made any moral arguments in defense of Israel or in defense of any nation state. I've simply described how the world works, but you're not arguing with me. You're arguing with someone in your head. So who is it in your head that you're arguing against? Now, I know that in the West, defenders of Israel primarily try to make their case on moral grounds, because making your case on moral grounds is the strongest way, the most effective way to make your case in international affairs in the West, because people in the West, they like to think of international affairs primarily in moral terms, while people in Asia, they tend to see the world in much more pragmatic ways. And so arguing primarily in moral terms is not particularly effective, say, if you were presenting your case to an Asian audience. Jewish rabbis all the time spoke out against Zionism in Israel and how it goes against Judaism. Yes, that's true. Orthodox rabbis, in particular, were strongly against Zionism until the creation of the Jewish state in 1948, and then the majority of Orthodox rabbis stopped talking about the evils of Zionism. You can't forcibly take land and ethnically cleanse it. Well, it happens all the time. So when you say you can't, what does that mean? Because you can, and it happens every day. The strong take what they want, the weak endure what they must. There was a big war about it, the whole world. So you're saying World War II was against German imperialism. The world decided it's not okay to forcibly take land and to ethnically cleanse it. Well, you don't know very much about World War II, right? At the end of World War II, ethnic Germans were forcibly cleansed from numerous nations and forced to return to Israel, and about 2 million ethnic Germans died in that process. So you have a fantasy about World War II because it meets your particular emotional needs, your needs to feel righteous, but your description of World War II and how it was against ethnic cleansing and the seizing of land by force, it has no basis in reality. So I'm curious why you wish to live in this fantasy world about World War II. So the founders of the Jewish state of Israel essentially emulated Stalin's policies of ethnic cleansing, and they would often explicitly model themselves on Stalin as they were creating the Jewish state. More and more Jews have been coming forward and speaking out against Zionism and Israel. So Zionism simply is an expression of Jewish nationalism, and Jews who have an intense in-group identity tend to be the most at ease with Zionism and Jewish nationalism, because an intense in-group Jewish identity is usually having a nationalist Jewish identity. Those Jews whose primary sense of identity is not within Jewry and not within Judaism, but within, say, an American or a liberal perspective on life, or a left-wing perspective, or a socialist perspective, yeah, they will be offended by the existence of an ethno-state they will be offended by nationalism, whether of the Jewish variety or of other varieties. Let me catch my breath there.
President Trump announcing big plans for FEMA after visiting parts of California devastated by wildfires and areas of North Carolina ravaged by Hurricane Helene. But first, more Israeli hostages released this weekend as the ceasefire deal holds
against militant cells in the area. I used to care for her, and she used to always ask for rice pudding. She used to love it and always asked for it. But now, Layla is gone. As Israeli forces continue to operate across the West Bank, there is that shaky ceasefire currently between Israel and Hamas. The Israeli...
So I have a confession to make, and I'm not ashamed of the following, and I'm not proud of it. But I think very little about Arab suffering or Palestinian suffering. And it's not because for 1 second I think that they're less human, that they're less children of God, that they're less worthy of empathy than any other group. It's just that my in-group, with whom I have an intense identity, Jews, has a life and death struggle with Palestinians. And in a life and death struggle, right, there's not going to be much empathy or forgiveness for the other side. So I don't expect Palestinians to celebrate the Jewish state or to have good feelings towards the Jewish state. And I don't even expect them to accept the Jewish state. And I simply accept that most Jews wish that Palestinians would disappear. Most Palestinians wish that Jews would disappear. And Fred Luskin, who wrote the best book on forgiveness, Forgive for Good, and who has worked with all sorts of groups around the world after horrible genocides, but he does not work with groups where there is not currently a political solution. And there's not currently a political solution for the conflicts between Israel and its enemies. And so there's no point right now in working on forgiveness for the out-group in that conflict because there's no viable political solution at hand. Fred Luskin has done powerful work with people from Ireland, from both sides of that conflict. He has worked with people on both sides of all sorts of genocidal conflicts around the world. But only after those conflicts have been settled, there's been a political resolution of the conflicts, and then the healing can begin. But while you're fighting for your life, there's no forgiveness. There's no empathy for the other side that can be expected. And so Fred Luskin, he does not work with groups where there is an ongoing political conflict, such as between Jews and Palestinians, because it's just not going to happen, right? If you are fighting for your life in a dark alley with someone trying to kill you, right, it's pointless to talk about having empathy for the person who's trying to kill you. It's pointless to talk about forgiving the person who's trying to kill you.
Say that Hamas is not holding up to their end of the bargain. They were supposed to release a list of hostages set to be released from Gaza during phase 1 of the agreement. They have not given the Israelis that list. Hamas has also not released Arbel Yehud, a young Israeli woman from the community of Nir Oz that was taken during the October 7th massacre. The Israelis say they will not allow Palestinians to return to northern Gaza until this issue is taken care of. Alicia?
Trey Ying's live in Tel Aviv. Thanks, Trey. Jonathan?
Alicia, so how are Israeli officials looking at this complex deal and how it is playing out? With us now, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon. Mr. Ambassador, it's always great to talk to you. I just want to pick up on what Trey was saying about Arbel Yehud, the fifth hostage who was supposed to be released. Chuck Grassley is speaking out this weekend after President...
No, it's very rare that I want to hear from ambassadors or from political appointees. They're just boring.
Trump fired 17 inspectors general at various federal agencies late Friday. The Iowa senator points out Congress was left in the dark, and he says Congress is supposed to get a 30-day notice before any IG is dismissed. Grassley says there may have been good reason they were axed, but he wants an explanation. Meanwhile, President Trump is standing by the move, saying it was, quote, a very common thing to do.
More of President Trump's cabinet picks preparing to face the Senate after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem were sworn in over the weekend. Health and Human Services nominee Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Director of National Intelligence nominee Tulsi Gabbard both preparing for their confirmation hearings in the coming days. Do these controversial picks face a tough road ahead? Let's ask Real Clear Politics' Phil Wegman. Phil, good to see you. You know, this past week was just filled with so much drama. It came down to the wire Friday night. What are you looking at this week? Who are you watching?
Well, the takeaway from what we saw this last week is that the Republican dam in the Senate...
What browser do you guys use? All right, Chrome, it seems to have dramatically become much bumpier and freezes up on me a lot more over the past few weeks. So I'm just curious what browser you use.
It didn't break yet. And that's why we're so focused on those two nominees that you just mentioned, RFK and Tulsi Gabbard, this week, because we're going to be seeing whether or not that Republican coalition can stay together. With Hegseth and Noem, what we saw is that there weren't enough defections to sink either of them. And I think this reflects two things. First, Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party in his own image. But more than that, he's won the debate on some of these central items, like immigration, like defense policy. And I think
we're going to have Brett Boyle, critic of Zionism, on our show within a few minutes. So look forward to talking to Brett.
What we're seeing is sort of the realignment in real time, where you have, according to polling, the majority.
So I think Pete Hegseth is a terrible choice for Secretary of Defense, not because of his personal life, just that he's shown no aptitude for leading any organization. I think Bobby Kennedy is a terrible choice at Department of Health and Human Services. I think all of Trump's health appointees are terrible, terrible choices.
Majority of the public supporting his vision for these things. We'll have to see, though, just how durable that realignment is.
However, if I were a U.S. Senator, I may well have voted to confirm Pete Hegseth because there is strength in cohesion. So even though I think Hegseth would be a terrible choice, I would want to be a good team member. It would diminish Donald Trump's aura of power if his nominees are voted down. And so even though I would think that Hegseth was a terrible choice, I wouldn't want to diminish Donald Trump at this time. So thinking I probably would have even voted to approve the nomination of Pete Hegseth and Bobby Kennedy and all of Trump's nominees, even though I think several of them are just terrible choices. I probably would have voted to approve them. I may have worked quietly behind the scenes to see if we could dissuade some of them to drop out. But if that didn't work, I would not want to diminish Donald Trump's aura, Donald Trump's power, Donald Trump's standing, the Republican Party's cohesion. So I would go against my own desires, my own wishes, my own conscience, I think, in the name of group cohesion. So part of having an intense in-group identity is that you lose a tremendous amount of personal freedom. And sometimes it's worth it to lose personal freedom for the sake of group cohesion. I was just reading a Steve Saylor blog post and realizing I don't know very much. And this is Steve Saylor on China. Forget it, Jake. China is Chinatown. Is China a vast psyop ruled from Beijing, or is it more run by grasping local officials? He used to try to keep up with the news out of China. But when the Great Awakening broke out in 2013, life here in America became too full of interest to stay abreast of China. Now that the Great Awakening seems to be winding down, perhaps I'll try to catch up. My impression was that Americans these days tend to greatly overestimate how centralized and unified is government power in China. When I asked on Twitter about the hilarious 21st century Chinese phenomenon of nail houses, right? Homeowners who refuse government buyouts and force the government to build highways around them, something you seldom see in America due to the perceived legitimacy of government power. And these photos are hilarious. I had no idea. I had no idea about this. Numerous people respond, this is just a psyop to persuade gullible non-Chinese that Beijing wasn't calling every single shot in China in a deviously complex but no doubt brilliant scheme. In response, I suggested that local and central officials weren't necessarily on the same page. Governance structure of China has always been decentralized because of inherent issues, language differences, mountainous terrain. There are a few efforts to try to resolve some of those, like language homogenization and infrastructure building, but these are long-term. Mostly Americans tend to assign centralization traits to China because the idea of a tyrannical communist government in the mind's eye of an American is direct rule from X, but that's never been the case. Government systems don't just invalidate inherent problems regarding scale. I had no idea about this. We Americans tend to assume the Chinese Communist Party controls everything from Beijing, the way Airstrip 1 is utterly run by the party in Orwell's 1984. But modern China seems to be more like how Philip Marlowe is confident when in his hometown Los Angeles that he's antsy when he drives into pleasant but crooked Bay City in the Big Sleep. Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. Seems more like the noir reality of modern China. China seems less dystopian totalitarian than noir. And local governments in China facing budget holes, right? They are crossing provincial borders to collect fines and drain company treasuries. Businesses call it a shakedown. Truth seems to be that the Chinese notion that all under heaven is ruled by an unchallengeable emperor is more an aspiration than a reality. Instead, heaven is high and the emperor is far away seems more like the mundane reality of China. Instead of Stalinist central control from the Kremlin, ordinary Chinese tend to perceive abuse by corrupt local government officials. They wish, they hope, they dream that de facto Emperor Xi Jinping could intervene on their behalf. That's pretty much how the kings won out over nobles in feudal Europe. That's an interesting perspective. I had no idea. All right, still, we're expecting to get Brett Boyle onto the show soon. I think we trust other people too much, too easily, and we extend trust usually in an ill-advised way. And why do we do it? Because of the biochemical rush we get from being victimized. So I'm just speaking from my own experience. All right, I got so addicted to the biochemical rush of being victimized that I consistently chose victimization rather than happiness throughout my life. So on a hot day, when I was offered ice cream, I would turn it down because I had some manufactured victim story in my head. When the most beautiful girl in the class in 6th grade asked me to be her boyfriend, I turned it down because I needed to maintain this victimization story in my head. And if you're addicted to debting or to under-earning or to some other emotional compulsion, you're addicted to a biochemical rush in your head that you get from engaging in self-sabotaging behavior. It's that biochemical rush that you get from engaging in self-sabotaging behavior that is the equivalent of alcohol for the addict to substances such as alcohol or drugs. And to get some recovery from my under-earning tendencies, all right, I had to come to terms with the extent to which this biochemical rush of victimization was something that I could not let go of. And so I think that we extend trust in an ill-advised manner so that we can maximize our opportunities to feel victimized. And I've been live streaming most every day since early 2018, and I noticed how many people have grown disillusioned with Donald Trump. And I think the primary reason for this is that they were seeking out unconsciously that biochemical rush that you get from a sense of being let down, betrayed, and victimized. And you cannot form any kind of relationship with anyone, right? You may even form a parasocial relationship with me, your humble live streamer, and then feel inevitably victimized when I have a completely different perspective on something that matters to you, or I change my mind on some hot button issue, and then you feel betrayed. Anytime you start any relationship, inevitably the other party is going to have different priorities from what you expect, and you are going to experience a biochemical rush of victimization. And it's like, here we go again. I've been screwed over by other people once again. So we extend our trust in an ill-advised, unthought-through manner to maximize our opportunities to get that biochemical rush of victimization. This is Alan Berger, PhD.
And this one really gets to a lot of people. The unreasonable expectation is that a good relationship is based on trust. And because you love someone, you should trust them. Wow. I've seen that cause so much trouble. What is the reality here? Well, the reality is that we trust each other much more than we should. True trust needs to be grounded in the reality of who each of us are and not on some ideal of how we should feel in a relationship.
I am worthy of your trust in some things, and I am unworthy of trust in other areas. Right? I behave ethically, responsibly, and truthfully in some parts of life, and I'm not nearly so upstanding in other situations.
Or how we should feel if we love another person. The myth behind this is that trust is unilateral, that I just give you trust. Well, authentic trust, true trust is not unilateral. True trust is a result of how we are with each other. It's bilateral. Someone said to me at one point, he said, do you realize that when two knights met on the road back in medieval times, that they stuck out their hand to shake hands? And you know why they shook hands? Because when they offered that person their hand, they were showing them that there was no sword in their hands. And therefore, at that moment, you could trust that that encounter would be safe.
Okay, I want to get Brett onto the show. Brett, not had the privilege of speaking with you before, so why don't you tell us a little bit about how you became involved in this issue of Zionism?
I've been speaking out against Israel and what they've been doing to Palestine since before there was an internet.
Wow.
Yeah, but I've been going against Zionists and the BS, forgive my expression, since there was an internet, since before there was an internet.
So give me a year. Was it like 1985, 1980?
Oh no, I was born in 76. As a teenager, as a kid, my parents weren't religious. I chose to be religious. At the age of 15, I decided and recognized that this wasn't, in my mind, right or how the world worked. So I rejected religion. I'm an atheist, and decided, well, if religion isn't how it works, then let's find out how the world works, and got involved in politics and economics and law, and I figured out how the world worked.
So what year did you really light up on this stuff?
Probably around the age of 16 or something like that. So probably around 90-ish.
93. So that's right after like the Oslo Accords, right? Those were
somewhere back around there, yeah.
And
I remember.
Go ahead.
I remember watching on TV when the Israelis stormed Arafat's compound and killed Arafat, and so I remember that. So it's been a while. I've been at this a while. I'm not new. I'm not new at all. There's some of my fellow Canadians. I was involved in the Freedom Convoy protest here in 2022. I'm not sure if you know about that.
Yes, I know a little bit. But why don't you tell people who don't know about that?
I was at the border blockade. I was at the border blockade here in Alberta, helping my fellow citizens shut down the border to the U.S. So I was part of that. Since October 7th happened, which you got to be careful about talking about. I've been, obviously my Palestine stance has come to the forefront again. And so I've had some of my fellow Canadian citizens giving me a hard time and being like, oh, you're going along with the current thing. And it's like, actually, I've been pro-Palestine for well over 25 years. This isn't new.
So when you were religious, what religion were you?
Christian.
Okay. And what's your ethnic heritage? You originally from Europe? Your ancestors from Europe, England, France? What?
My great-grandparents came over to Canada as refugees in World War II. During World War II, they fled they're from Romania. They fled Nazi Germany, World War II. Farmers. So I have quite an issue with people that Canada and the U.S. is a nation full of immigrants and refugees. Like it's. I would try and remind people of that everybody that's white here is a descendant, is either a refugee or immigrant or a descendant thereof. Every single white person in North America, because it seems like we've really forgotten that in today's society. And I swear my great-grandparents would roll over in their graves with how poorly the immigrants are being treated. And I guess if you're white and Christian, you don't count as a refugee or something, but they were refugees. Just because they were white and Christian, it doesn't mean that they weren't refugees, right? So,
and were there any individuals who were particularly influential on you around the age of 16, 17, 18 with regard to these issues?
Nope. The only thing that was ever... I actually used to be pro-Israel way back then.
So tell me more about that. Tell me about how you came to be pro-Israel, and then tell me how you became concerned about Israel.
Well, I think a lot of the pro-Israel stance that I had was actually based on a lot of like propaganda and stuff like that. It used to be, I think it still might be, but it used to be, it was stated that the Israelis had like some of the best pilots in the world as far as fighter aircraft and stuff. And I was always big on the planes, on the jets. I had a fascination with aircraft. My grandfather was a pilot, so it's it was something that's normal as far as the family goes with aviation. And so yeah, with the touting of Israelis as great pilots, and it was always, the propaganda always tells us that Israel are the good guys, right? And so, I had mentioned, I can't even remember, it was a long time ago. I must have been probably 10, 11, or 12, somewhere in there. I mentioned something about Israel and pilots and, whatever. And all my mom said to me was, it's not very nice how the Israelis treat the Palestinians. And she said, and that's all I'm going to say about it. You decide for yourself when you grow up how and what you want to think. But I don't think it's very nice how the Israelis treat the Palestinians. And truthfully, and not another word was ever said. And it kind of, by the time I was a few years later a teenager and looked in and found out, some things about international law and just, etc. And I remember when the internet first came out, it was the Windows 95 and Windows 98 were all brand new. That was, I've been on the internet since there's been an internet, and playing in the gaming zone, the MSN gaming zone. You might remember that.
I haven't gamed, but I do remember the internet. Yeah, I'm older than you. Yeah.
I play a lot of backgammon and crib and stuff like that. So it was just go and hang out and play a game of backgammon type thing. But the conversation came up in topic one day in the general forum of discussion. And literally all I said was the same thing that my mother said to me that one day, where I don't think it's very nice how the Israelis treat the Palestinians. And wow, did I ever get attacked. I got called anti-Semitic and all these flippant things. And it was like, what are you even talking about? So that's when it really struck me, where it's like, I didn't even say anything bad. I didn't say anything wrong. All I said was, it's not nice how the Israelis treat the Palestinians. And I came under fire. There's people waged war on me. So it was like, I'm going to defend my position.
Did you know Jews when you were a child? Were there Jews around?
Not that Canada is very different than the U.S. religion doesn't play a huge role in our society, like at all. If anything, there's I'd say the vast majority of our society, we don't want to hear about religion. We're fine with it. You go be a Christian or a Muslim or whatever you want to be. None of us give a crap. Like, we don't care. As long as you're not pushing it down each other's throats, we don't give a shit.
Right, but I just asked you a simple question. Did you know Jews growing up? No, neither did I. So I didn't know any till I was 22.
I did, however, I used to be part of youth group at church, and I actually went to Bible camp. I was a counselor, everything. Like, I did all of that, right? A youth counselor. But I do remember we did go to church one day, and we had speakers. We had Christian speakers that were Semitic people from the Holy Land, and they were Palestinian. Like,
what type of church? What denomination?
That was a Baptist church.
Okay, and what age did you become an atheist?
That was a long time ago.
What age did you become an atheist?
15.
Okay, so what role did your sexual desire play in you becoming an atheist, if any?
None. That's a weird question.
Well, for me, it was huge. I wanted to fuck around. Like, I think people choose a sex life.
No role or significance or nothing.
It does. So you think that's weird? But that was huge for me. Like, I wanted to fuck around.
What played the biggest role for me was actually, there was lots of times I would go to church and be sitting in the pew, and, you hear the pastor talk, whatever. And, there was, at that time I was a lot younger, and quite often they talk about things that I didn't know about necessarily. And I remember there was a conversation. I remember the day it happened still, because I was sitting in the pew, and the topic they were discussing, I had actually read. It was like, oh, I actually know this one. Like, awesome. Like, I know this one. I've read this. Like, I finally, I'll be able to, like, follow along, and, like, I've actually read this, and I can follow along this time. And the pastor gave me, like, a completely different interpretation than what I took away from it. And it was that moment that I realized that all this is just like a game of telephone played throughout centuries and millennia, where it's just, you're getting one person's interpretation of another person's interpretation of another person's interpretation. And it's like, because how I interpreted it was extremely different than how he had interpreted it. And it was like, this is just a game of telephone. All we're getting is people's interpretations of different interpretations of different interpretations. Like, what is actually real, true, and accurate? And it's like, I'm not sure this is, like, giving me the reality of our world. Like, and if it's not religion, we better figure it out. So that's what got me into politics and economics. Like, I remember being 16 and 17 and going over to my girlfriend's, and, I had a long time girlfriend at that time. So we'd spend the night at each other's houses and stuff like that. And I would bring my own work, because I was going to the library and, doing research and stuff like that. And my girlfriend's mom would ask me, like, oh, what school project are you working on? And it's like, oh, this isn't for school. Like, this is just my own research. And, like, I'm going to the library outside of school time to investigate my own things. And she was like, that's really weird. And it's like, well, I want to know shit. So.
Yeah. You're a lot like me. I fell in love with reading books at about age 7. How about you? What age did you fall in love with books?
I normally always read to kind of escape reality. I liked my Dragonlance books or whatever. It was always like, I'd go have a bath and read a book and kind of escape for an hour and read a Dragonlance book or whatever. So, but as a young age, like, my family was quite well read. My mom read a ton of books. She actually got my name from a book. My real first name, which is Brett Boyle is Brett is my middle name. Tori is actually my legal first name. But my mom read a ton of books. She always had her nose in a book. So my brother and I were quite, we were taught words at a young age, and etc. The value of words as well. The pen is mightier than the sword type deal things.
So I love reading books. I love reading books in and of themselves, but also I spent a great deal of time reading books because I was lonely and socially maladjusted. Did you feel much loneliness in your childhood or a sense of being socially maladjusted?
No. I spent a lot of time alone. I had a father that worked a lot, was away at work a lot and stuff like that. And my mom, again, always had her nose in a book. So you're kind of like left to your own devices to a certain extent, as long as you weren't getting in trouble. No harm, no foul type deal thing. So
you had a happy childhood, sounds like. Did you have a happy childhood?
I'm not sure I would say happy. Probably not how I would put it, but I definitely was. My mom encouraged us how to think, not what to think. We didn't have things beaten into our head type deal thing. It was very much like she, again, like the whole Israel-Palestine thing, where she was like, all I'm going to say is that it's not nice how the Israelis treat the Palestinians, and I'm going to leave it at that. She wasn't really about beating things into us or instilling things into us or whatever. It was more like, think for your own damn self, question everything everybody says. Just because you hear or read something doesn't mean you believe it, even if that's popular. Like it was very much instilled to us how to think. Like,
so you had a girlfriend in high school, and like every guy wants a girlfriend in high school. I didn't get to have sex till I was 22. So you don't have to tell me, but at what age did you begin that great exploration?
Right around the same time. I had a couple girlfriends in high school, and when I was young, I was 15. I had a girlfriend that was a couple years older and actually already had a kid. So it was, she was,
And what was that experience like? For me, it was just incredible. It blew my mind.
I was a couple grades lower, and I was, dating, one of the pretty girls in school that was popular and etc. And so, obviously it's, everybody knows who you are, right? When you're dating a popular pretty girl that's a couple years older too, that's, everybody knew who you were. So it was whatever.
How did you land her?
I didn't have popularity issues or anything like that.
But how did you land a hot older girlfriend?
I don't know. I think I asked her if I could carry her school books one day, because she's very smart. She actually went on to become an engineer. She's very intelligent. But I just asked her if I could carry her books one day, I do believe, and she thought that was sweet, and we had a laugh and whatever. And
so this is how other people saw me in high school, that I was incredibly argumentative, that I was always completely self-assured, even when I didn't know what I was talking about. And other people just didn't know how to handle my desire to argue. And so I was weird. What was your reputation in high school?
Oh, I'm definitely weird. But honestly, I could go into any clique. Like, I played in school band, but yet I played in school sports. And yet I was like, smoking and drinking in the skid pit type deal thing. Like I could go from group to group to group to group and just like communicate and like not have an issue type deal thing. So
what age did you get online? Was it 1993 when you were 16?
No, the internet didn't really exist then. It was more in between Windows 95 and Windows 98. I remember Windows 98 being brand new.
Okay.
So
did you go to college?
Right around, 97 type deal thing. 96, 97, somewhere in there.
Did you go to college?
Basically, I've been on the internet since there's been an internet, more than less.
Okay. Did you go to college?
No.
Okay. And have you lived in the same area pretty much your entire life, Alberta?
No.
So you moved around?
I was born and raised in British Columbia, Canada, actually.
So how many different homes, how many different locations did you live in, say, in your first 18 years?
Oh, I don't know. We moved a little bit, moved a few times, mostly in British Columbia, in Prince George, but I did spend some time in another city, Fort St. John. We briefly moved to Ontario for, about 8 months or something like that, and then came back.
So maybe 6 times, 10 times?
I've always had family in Alberta since my family came to Canada. So even though I was born and raised in BC, I've always had a kind of a home in Alberta as well. So basically I say I'm from Western Canada. I've spent half my life in British Columbia, half my life in Alberta. So more
right, but how many different? How many different?
6 times.
6 to 9 times in your first 18 years. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on. I'm not talking about different towns necessarily.
No, I'm talking about different towns because it is a trauma to move when you're a kid. At least it was for me.
I didn't have a problem with it. I'm not socially awkward or anything like that. So even when we moved across the country to Ontario and I started a new school, I had friends right away, and I never had any kind of. I don't have those kind of social issues generally.
Okay, but when I asked you if your childhood was happy, you said no. So what if you feel comfortable saying, I don't want to push you to say anything that's against your own interest, but to the extent you feel comfortable, let me finish my question. Hang on. Let me finish my question. So for me, constantly moving was an incredibly deep source of pain in my childhood. What were the deepest sources of pain for you in your childhood?
Probably some of the people close dying, I guess.
Yeah.
That would probably be the biggest one. Or a pet dying. Like that's, as a child, you're not, again, I'm not, I don't want to go too into.
No, I don't want you to say anything.
My whole childhood upbringing. But if you're looking for some kind of parental influence as far as my views today, there's none.
No, I'm just looking to get to know you as my own childhood is the prism through which I see the world. So, for example, I have a bias towards an optimistic view of the world outside. So I look for news that feeds into my own desire for happiness. And I notice that other people around me have a predilection for depression. And so whenever they see news events, they just get new reasons to feel depressed. So my working theory is we don't see the world outside as it is. We see the world outside as we are. What do you think of that theory?
I can't, I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but I know with me, I don't care. I just see the world as how it is. And I would like to think that I see the bigger pictures of the things going on. Everybody gets wrapped up in the details and the narratives of what we're supposed to think and not question. And I always try and keep in mind that there's quite often bigger pictures at play that are more behind the scenes that aren't just broadcast to the world. There's usually something bigger going on. And it's, again, I don't care what it is. I'm more interested in just the truth, regardless of what that truth is. I don't give a shit one way or the other. For instance, I'm an atheist. I have no religious horse in any race. So, people, because of my Palestine stance, which, by the way, is the homeland and birthplace of Christianity. But people always like, oh, the Muslims are getting to you. The Muslims are getting to you. I'm like, I'm not a fucking Muslim. I'm sorry. It's like, I'm not a freaking Muslim. Like, I'm an atheist. I don't, it's not about Islam or Judaism or Christianity. It's not about any of that to me. I have no religious horse in the race. I have no favoritism to show. I don't care. It's about the truth one way or the other, whatever that truth may be. And I think that there's, as you were saying, it's like a lot of confirmation bias with people, right? Where they don't want to hear what goes against them. They just want to hear what, they seek their echo chambers and they want to hear the same like-minded people and views. And a way to put it is a lot of people, they want to hear what they're thinking come out of other people's mouths. You know what I mean? With that kind of confirmation bias.
So
and I'm not like that.
Yeah. How do you know that you see the world as it is rather than through the lens of your own confirmation biases?
I think a very much unbiased approach and perspective with that. How I was saying, like, I don't care. I don't have a bias. I got that from my grandmother. My grandmother was very much like that she didn't play favorites. If somebody deserved to get in trouble, then they got in trouble, and it didn't matter who it was. If it was her kid or a neighbor kid, or it didn't matter. There was no favoritisms. There was no bias. It was what was right, what was wrong, period. Like, you don't play favorites. You don't have biases. You don't play that way. Like, that's not a fair and equal way to be with people. So that's kind of the approach that I have. I'm not saying that I got it from her, but does seem to be a trait and characteristic that I have in my family. It's not the confirmation bias. We don't have those kind of tendencies to just hear what we want to hear or play favoritism. I don't play favorites. That's something I just do not do. So
which books have most influenced you? Not just on this issue, but on anything.
I don't read a lot of books, to be honest. Again, when I read a book, it's usually to like escape. Like, I'll go read like a fantasy novel in the bathtub type deal thing where I'm actually escaping from the world. I actually read a lot more of like treaties and laws, and I read a lot of that kind of stuff. I read a lot of laws. I read a lot, but it's not necessarily books. I learned a long time ago to, like, okay, if I want to know a law or about a law, I don't go to a vlogger. I look up the actual law and read the actual law my own damn self. So to avoid those biases, right? I don't want to get another person's influence or how their interpretation. I don't want that influencing me in my interpretation. So instead of listening to, whoever's interpretation, or they figure they went and read the law, so they'll tell the other people, which I do all the time. I'm not going to lie, but I always say, don't believe me. Don't just listen to me. Here's where you can find the law. Go look it up for yourself and read it for yourself. That's very much how I operate. I don't want myself or other people to just blindly listen to and follow people. I guess I get that from a bit of my upbringing where, mom raised people like me and my brother. It's like how to think. Don't just mindlessly believe what other people tell you. That's, bad things happen when people do that. So
what's that flag behind you?
That's the Palestine flag. Come on now.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Look how ignorant I am. So have you been to Israel or Palestine or the Middle East?
I would absolutely never in a million years ever go to Israel ever. Ever, ever, ever. I would never give them any recognition or support in any way, shape, or form. I have open invitation to go to Palestine anytime I want from a number of people. Like I said, I've been at this a lot of years. Literally all of my Palestinian friends tell me, don't come here. Absolutely do not come to Palestine. I can sit. Look, Israel and I both acknowledge that we're each other's. I'm an enemy of the state of Israel. They know it. I know it. My Palestinian friends have all said, like, don't come here because the Israelis they'll disappear you. Like the way I talk, the things I say, the messages that I put out, they're like, you can't come here. Like, especially I'm the type of person that takes action. So if I see injustice going on, I see a group of people beating on some old woman, I'm going to jump in the fight and go kick some ass. That's just my personality. I'm not one to stand and just, I'm going to go jump in the fight, not pull out my freaking phone camera. You know what I mean? So because of that, and because of the things I say, my Palestinian friends are like, you can't come here. Like, Israel will disappear you. So hopefully one day Palestine will be free and I'll be able to go there without the threat of the Zionist Israelis disappearing me or hurting me or detaining me or any of that crap. So I've been to jail. It's not fun.
Yeah.
Not a fan.
Why did you go to jail? What happened?
I've been to jail a couple times. But the last time it was because basically a guy threatened me, was trying to intimidate me, again, threatened me. And I told him, it's like, if I get out of this truck, I'm going to put you in the hospital. And he didn't believe me. He was very much bigger than me. And he didn't believe me. He laughed and whatever. And he pushed me too far. And I got out of the truck and he woke up in the hospital.
So I'm a fervent Zionist. Do you think I'm a bad person, or do you think I'm just wrong?
I think you're just wrong.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think you're a bad person, but I do think you're wrong. And I would add to that, it might not be entirely through your own doing necessarily, because I can tell my observations. This is just my observations, or my opinion, if you would. I can tell that you've in your youth or in your past that you've had a lot of Zionist influence on you. I've noticed that you repeat a lot of like the Zionist talking points or the Zionist perspectives and like the Zionist propaganda. Like, for example, earlier we were talking about the ethnic cleansing and genocide of, say, North America with the indigenous people. And that's one of the things that really bothers me is when people just like shrug it off, where it's like, oh, well, ethnic cleansing and genocide, that's how North America came to be. And that's how Australia came to be. So it's no big deal if there's ethnic cleansing and genocide happening in Palestine. And to me, that's the wrong attitude and approach. We're supposed to learn from our past history and mistakes. So yeah, it's a big deal. Biggest genocide in history is of the North American First Nations people, which as part of the Freedom Convoy, I still have the flag in the back of my truck flying, and it's an indigenous flag because it's recognition of the indigenous people and the genocide and ethnic cleansing that occurred to them. And they deserve to be respected and honored and some homage paid to them, right? They need some homage paid to them. So it's, in my mind, the same thing with, the narratives of World War II. When rounding people up for deportation and ethnic cleansing and stuff is not a good thing, right? It's a bad thing. The world decided that wasn't okay. So it really bothers me. It irks me when I hear that, like, oh yeah, well, we've ethnically cleansed and genocided North America, so big deal if we do it to Palestine. Like, no, it is a big deal. Like, we're still clearly not learning as a society and species if we're using one ethnic cleansing and genocide to try and justify another one. That's a horrendous attitude in my mind.
So let's step back a bit and go to first principles. So, for example, I get my first principles with regard to morality from Torah. I am a convert to Orthodox Judaism, and as with all converts, I probably come from a place of deep pain, deep dysfunction, that obviously there's something quite weird when someone not born Jewish with no Jewish genetics ups and converts to Orthodox Judaism as an adult. But that's where I get my moral first principles. So where do you get your first principles with regard to what is right and wrong?
I'm not sure I'm following the question necessarily.
Okay, so
I don't need a religious textbook to tell me that ethnic cleansing and genocide is not okay and is wrong.
I know, but what's the basis for morality? So I understand that people who are not religious also believe fervently in what is right and wrong, and you don't need to be religious. You don't need to believe in God to believe that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. So the basis for my moral vision for the world comes from Torah and the belief that God gave the Torah to the Jewish people. So I have a faith basis for my moral worldview. Where do you get your moral worldview? Where does it come from? Is it something you developed entirely on your own? Was it something you inherited? What? Tell me more.
Well, like I was saying earlier there about my grandmother, where you don't play favorites. It's if somebody's doing something wrong, then they deserve to get in trouble, and it doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter if it's your best friend or your kid or like some complete stranger, right? If your best friend or kid or something is doing something wrong to a complete stranger, you don't just automatically take your kids or friend's side. You be unbiased and like don't play favorites, and like right is right and wrong is wrong. Like,
but what's the basis? Where does that come from that certain behavior is right and certain behavior is wrong? So for me, I would point to the Torah and developments on the Torah, but what's the basis of your thinking about certain things being right and wrong?
Maybe just societal standards. Like it's not right to go stab a lady on the bus stop and steal her purse. Like, and if the societal standard and norm becomes where that is okay, I'm probably still going to say that's not okay. Right? Just as we're seeing today, right? With this whole freaking swamp donkey Trump. I know you're a Trump fan. I absolutely cannot stand him. And I'm seeing more and more and more today. It's just amazing to watch it happen before our eyes. The absolute outright racism that we've been seeing. I've been seeing more people these days say the N-word in reference to black people than I have seen my whole entire life. Like, it's just been remarkable, this surge and comeback of racism and the derogatory terminology that was being used towards black people or like Arabs or whatever, this derogatory, divisive, racist attitude, terminology. It is amazing to just, especially we're supposed to be, 2025, all humans deserve equal. I'm an egalitarian. Mm-hmm. So I'm a hardcore egalitarian, like to the beyond. So everybody, regardless of age or race or political affiliation, gender, whatever, all deserve equal rights and equal opportunities, period. Like, you can't be discriminated against by your skin color, by your, religious beliefs. Like, we shouldn't be discriminating people for things like that, especially things like skin color or gender that's like not even in their control, right? Like, that's just crazy talk in my mind. So
let's say there was a small business near you, and they only wanted to hire people of the same skin color and, let's say, religion as the owner of the small business. Would you like to see them prosecuted for violating anti-discrimination laws?
Well, 100%. Definitely. And it doesn't matter which way. I don't care if you're white or brown or black or whatever. No, those discriminatory tactics are, that's not going to further any kind of egalitarian society if those practices are continued or supported. It's up to us to be saying, hey, that's not okay. Like, and again, it doesn't matter what race or religion or anything like that. Again, that goes back to the not having bias and not playing favorites. And it's just like, what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. Like, period. So
who are your biggest heroes?
Who are my biggest heroes?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I really have a lot of, in quotes, heroes. I don't really, I guess that gets back to me being an egalitarian where I see everybody as equals. To me, that might actually help because I've met a lot of stars, for example, a lot of like famous people and stuff. And to me, we're all just people. So they don't get special treatment. They just get spoken to like a regular person, just like you and I are talking right now.
Yeah.
I don't get starstruck. It helps kind of keep an even keel. So as far as heroes go, I'm not really sure I'd have it. People that I would maybe say there's a bit of respect for, and that, you kind of give the head nod of kind of approval or appreciation, might be somebody like, like a Nelson Mandela, who stood up for his beliefs and stood up for what was right and went to jail for it. And, he was called a terrorist at one point and came out a freedom fighting hero, right? Like a Leonard Peltier is another one who just got recently, released from prison last minute by Biden. And I know nobody likes Biden. I'm not saying I do either, but it was good to see Leonard Peltier to get, his freedom. He was the longest political prison in history here in North America type deal thing. So, that kind of people that are willing to sacrifice for others and what they stand up and believe in, I think they deserve a little bit of, honor, a little bit of respect. But as far as heroes go, I don't really have any heroes per se.
So if I were
I'd say probably one of my biggest heroes, if I were to have to put it that way, would probably be my grandmother, who didn't play favorites, didn't play biases, wasn't about all that. Just an average woman. Let me tell you, when she passed away, our family was absolutely amazed at the amount of people that showed up for her funeral. It was unbelievable. Probably half the town came. There was definitely, I don't even know how many people. We ran out of room. We got the biggest venue in town that we could find, and we ran out of room. People were backing out into the parking lots, like standing room only out the building, because she was so popular and well liked, and she was just an average, woman. She was a chef at a hotel restaurant. She was her union lead, but she was just an average person. But because of her outlooks and stance and attitude, that she was just well loved by an amazing amount of people. And if I could get like a quarter of the people that were at her funeral, holy cow, I'd feel like I was doing good. That's okay, her issues. You can eat.
Okay.
Don't care.
So you're an opponent of this. You're an opponent of the state of Israel. Are you an opponent of the state of Canada?
My government, yes.
100%.
And that's not just the liberal one. I freaking hate conservatives. Like, with a passion do I hate conservatives. So I've never voted liberal in my life. Never have. I've never voted. I'm not sure if you're familiar with our political system here, but another major party we have here is called the NDP, the New Democratic Party. I've never voted for them either. Never voted NDP, never voted liberal. But I freaking hate the conservatives. They're just as corrupt as the liberals are. Can't stand the conservatives.
How do you feel about the origins of the nation state of Canada and the role that genocide and ethnic cleansing played in the creation of Canada?
Oh, it's 100% not right. But the Canada is different from the U.S. in a lot of senses. Like, you guys rebelled against the Brits and had a big war with them, and like, we just waited and were patient and asked nicely, and we got a country. Right? Like, you know what? We'd like to be a country now, and they're like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, sounds good. But no, I've been against. I've said it for a long time. Hence, I pay homage to the Indigenous people. It was the biggest genocide in history, and that's why it's so. We're supposed to learn from it, right? I can't go back in the past and go change it, right? Just, they were stopped. They were still doing residential schools in Canada like 50 years ago, like. So it's not like some long lost, past forgotten thing. 50 years ago, in the bigger scheme of things, is just like yesterday in history, right? So we're supposed to learn from these things, and knowing the genocide and ethnic cleansing of the First Nations people here in Canada and the US and stuff. Yeah, we're not supposed to be letting that happen. Right? It's a bad thing. We're supposed to learn from it. So that's why it's like, you know what? This genocide and ethnic cleansing that happened in North America, it was very bad. It was very wrong. You can't just genocide Indigenous people and act like you're morally good. Like, that's just crazy talk. So you can't just genocide and ethnically cleanse the Semitic Indigenous people of Palestine by white Europeans and North Americans called Zionists, and then sit there and act like you're the morally superior ones. That's crazy talk. Completely crazy talk. And you sure as heck don't use the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the indigenous people of North America to try and justify and be like, well, it's happened before, so it's okay if it happens again. What that shows and proves is that it's not being learned in society from past mistakes. Same thing as with World War II. Apparently, we didn't learn anything from that if we're just going to allow it to happen again. And that's where I have big issue, where it's like, I acknowledge, that's why I said that when I do hashtag never again, that means everybody. Arab, Muslim, indigenous First Nations, the Muslims in China, whoever, it doesn't matter. The group. Ethnic cleansing and genocide is not okay. And it doesn't matter who's doing it or who is the victims. It is wrong. And it's supposed to be hashtag never again for everybody. So I don't like hearing ethnic cleansing and genocide that just because it's happened before, that means that we should just shrug it off and act like it's nothing going forward or in the future. That's in my mind, a really bad, wrong attitude and approach to take. And that's, you're just perpetuating it's just perpetuating the cycle of our society of shit happening over and over and over again, and nobody learning from it because it's lack of ability for us to be calling it out, trying to stop it, saying it's wrong, etc.
Are there any nation states that you regard as morally legitimate?
Palestine.
It's not a nation state.
Well, it's been on maps for thousands of years. Before Jesus was born, if you believe in that sort of thing, it was being referred to and called Palestine. It's been on maps for thousands of years. So it's,
So, what other nation states? I mean, do you regard Japan?
It doesn't really seem like it was built and founded on ethnic cleansing and genocide. The funny part is, it's actually Christians that were the ones that expelled Jews from Jerusalem. And it was the Arab Muslims that brought the Jews back to Jerusalem, not once, but twice, after the Christians expelled them. So it blows me away how there's so many, in quotes, Jews or Christians want to say that, Arabs and Muslims hate Jews and they just want to see us all dead, when literally it was Arabs and Muslims that brought the Jews back to Jerusalem twice. So
before there were ever Jews, there was ethnic cleansing and genocide going on in the land that's now Palestine.
So an issue I'm having with you, Luke, is you're conflating the past with the present. So in past, 1,000 years ago, it was very normal and commonplace for one ruling nation to invade and conquer and take over another, right?
Yes.
Since that time, it has come to pass where now there's like laws on the books and international laws that you can't just militarily forcibly take another person's land and redraw borders and like do that through occupying force, because it has things like ethnic cleansing and genocide attached to it. Like, it's not okay. It's just, countries can't just do that anymore. We're supposed to be stopping that behavior, right? Because it's not okay. So that's why I have a problem with, it's like when you're using one ethnic cleansing or genocide to try and justify, like from hundreds of years ago, to try and justify what's happening now today. Not only is it a really bad attitude and outlook, in my opinion, but it's also not acknowledging international law, where international law says you can't do that, right? That's why Germany doesn't have Poland in its borders and etc. Because the world was like, you cannot just invade and take over another country and like militarily do that. Like, that's not okay. There was a big war about it. World said it's not okay. So why try and justify it for freaking Israel? Like,
I don't believe I've tried
to. It's not okay what Israel's doing. Period.
Right. I haven't tried to justify anything. I haven't made any moral arguments. I've simply talked about how the world works.
I was really not happy with the attitude where you're just trying to shrug it off. It's just like, oh, well, you know, Canada and the U.S. were built on ethnic cleansing and genocide, so that's the way it is. It's okay if Israel does it to Palestine. No, it's not. Like, and by saying that, what you're showing by saying that is what you're showing is that you haven't learned from the past, and you're also not acknowledging the laws in our society in which we live today. So, or how we're supposed to be living today.
So is it possible to have a conversation about how the world works separate from a conversation about how the world should work?
Sure.
Right, because I have not consciously, now maybe I'm deluded, I know I have biases and blind spots, but I have not consciously spoken today, to the best of my knowledge, about how the world should work. I've simply talked about how the world does work. I haven't tried to make a moral case for Israel. That's not something that I think I do.
You did earlier just try and shrug it off to ethnic cleansing and genocide that Israel is committing. You did try to relate it to and shrug it off like, oh, well, you know, we ethnically cleansed and genocided the First Nations people, so that's how the world works. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that statement either. However, that's not how the world should work. That's
Is it possible that we've been having two separate conversations? I'm talking about how the world does work, and you're primarily talking about how the world should work. So perhaps we're speaking at cross purposes.
That's what I was just going to touch on that, where by us making those excuses or turning a blind eye or ignoring, or however you want to look at it, phrase it, that doesn't change the world. That just perpetuates things and keeps the cycle going. It's up to us that should know better to stand up and say, hey, that's not okay. Like, if people don't stand up and voice out when something is wrong, then nothing's going to change. Regarding one again, you look at the famous picture of the Nazis, where you have all these Nazis standing up doing the freaking Roman, the Zig Heil, whatever, and there's one lone guy in the crowd that refuses to do it. You got to be that one lone guy. Tiananmen Square, buddy standing in front of a tank, one lone person doing the right thing can shape and change the course of the future. I'm not necessarily saying Tiananmen Square did, but it's the idea that regardless, even if it's just you by yourself, you got to stand up and say something if something is wrong and not good. Well, otherwise, nothing changes. Everything is just allowed to perpetuate. Cycles are allowed to continue. Nothing changes. Why? Like, it's pointless to have all these hashtag never again if we're just going to perpetuate the same freaking thing over and over and over again. What does never again mean? Nothing. If you just continue on with the same behavior going forward. So
something that,
I'll be the one person.
Okay. So something that we seem to have in common is that we're both deeply interested in the Middle East and these issues that we've been talking about, and most people are not. Most people are primarily interested in themselves, in their family, making a living. Is that fair? And so what's it been like for you going through life where you're deeply interested in things that I bet 95% of the people around you are not that interested in?
Frustrating. Frustrating. It's like, I always relate it to, like, say you're watching a movie or something like that, or it's like you know who the bad guy is, and you try and tell people, and they won't listen to you. Yeah. Like, and you're sitting there frustrated, being like, I know who the bad guy is, and you try and are telling people, and like, oh, you're crazy, and they don't believe you, and you don't get listened to, and it's so to put yourself into that position, it's very frustrating, So,
yeah,
that's pretty much explained it to a bit is frustration. That said, because I've always been highly political, I dated an MP's daughter back when I was 20, 21, who actually heads a party here now in Canada, or like her dad. So I have had people around that are in the political realm. The 20, I was dating a girl whose dad was an MP stuff like that. So politics has played a bit of a role. It hasn't been just everybody, but I will say in the past few years, especially ever since the Freedom Convoy protests here in Canada in 2022, there's been a very big awakening as to what the heck the politicians are doing. Like, we better start paying more attention, especially since October 7th happened. A lot of people that had written off what I was saying about Palestine and Israel in past now have come back to me and saying, hey, I didn't listen to you back then, but I'd really like to know a lot more about what's happening there now, because apparently that's important. And I told people that, I'm not sure how long you've known or paid attention to politics, but we had a previous prime minister here, Stephen Harper, and leader of the Conservatives. And when he got in, that was like 18 years ago or something like that, I noticed some things that set off red flags with me. And it was like, hey, we are starting down the path of fascism. Like, I'm getting red flags here, knowing how the Germans got turned into Nazis. You could see some of those things starting to repeat. And it was like, red flag, red flag, red flag. So it's, I'm calling out some of this stuff for almost 20 years, where people don't seem to recognize how the Germans got turned into Nazis. Like, there's a disconnect between what mechanisms were used to turn very educated, very intelligent people, the Germans, who had some of the best engineers in the world, highly advanced, highly educated. How do you turn these highly advanced, highly educated people into thinking that rounding people up was doing their civic duty, and blaming, an ethnic minority and a small group of immigrants for all the problems in your country? How do you turn these, what you would think are intelligent people, into believing that crazy stuff? And now we're seeing it all over again with freaking Zion Dawn there. Like, I'm seeing my fellow citizens be walked down the path of fascism in a repeat of how the Germans got turned into Nazis. I'm watching the same thing happen to my fellow citizens, and I don't freaking like it.
Okay, I'm going to move on, but I want to give you a couple of minutes to say anything that I haven't brought up, anything that you want to add. So the time is yours. Anything that you want to talk about?
Honestly, and I appreciate the discussion. I know I come off as quite an asshole. I can be quite an asshole, but I do appreciate the good, honest discussion. And I would, if anything, like to just talk to you for a second in saying... Oh, yeah, feel free to ask me anything that you want. Well, I'd say more of an observation, in that, like what we were talking about earlier and before with confirmation biases and, people want to seek out like-minded people and stuff like that, that it is a good idea to listen to and hear and pay attention to things that are outside of an echo chamber or a confirmation bias or whatever. And it's, there are other sides to things. So maybe, I don't know. I guess it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, my youth and stuff like that, where mom raised me and my brother to think, to ask questions, to have critical thinking, to not just believe, to get other sides and develop and form our own opinions and stuff like that. Because you seem to have a lot of kind of the Zionist propaganda or Zionist storylines really embedded into you. And in the past, since October 7th especially, there have been a lot of Jews and a lot of Jewish rabbis, etc., that have been coming forward, speaking out very loudly, very clearly, and trying to very much separate and distinguish between Zionism and Judaism, because they are two very different things. And there's been this, that was, in my mind, part of some of, got to be careful what you say. I just got a strike yesterday on my channel for talking about October 7th. I'm not sure if you know, but there was a new law passed about October 7th. Be careful if you talk about that.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of censorship.
I just got a strike yesterday for talking about it. Israel just passed a new law in regards to October 7th. You all take the time to look it up and look what's involved with that, because it's going to affect you at some point, probably. But questioning things it's important to not just believe blindly or wholeheartedly. And I sense that a lot from you, where you take the Zionist narrative as the actual one or real one. And I catch a lot of flack because I'm so anti-Israel, right? And so anti-Zionist, where people are like, oh, you're anti-Semitic. And it's like, well, the Palestinians are Semitic people, number one, and I love them. But number two, I also promote a lot of Jews on my channel. I post Jewish rabbis all the time, like all the time. Jen Perlman, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She lives in Florida. She ran for Congress. She's a Jew, and she is heavily opposed to Zionism in Israel. So I'm liking seeing all these Jewish people. Katie Helper is another one. She's Jewish and is against Zionism in Israel. Just because somebody is against Zionism in Israel doesn't mean that they hate Jews or anti-Semitic or anything like that. And there's lots of Jews out there, especially these days, that are super talking about being against Israel and against Zionism. And it needs to have the two differentiated again, because Zionism seems to be hijacking Judaism, and they're hiding behind Jews. They're using Zionism, which is a political ideology. It's not a religious ideology. It's a political one. The Zionists are hiding behind Jews. And they're saying, if you speak out against us, or if you are hating on us taking over Palestine, that means you hate Jews. And that is completely a falsehood. That couldn't be more wrong. Just because you're against Zionism and against Israel doesn't mean a person hates Jews. And but somebody like me, again, who's an atheist, and I'm sitting there posting Jewish rabbis like pretty consistently, and Jewish rabbis are saying Zionism and Israel go against Judaism. It's keeping him. I'm not here to lecture you about your beliefs, but as I understand Judaism,
yeah, I get it. I
read up on some of it, and listening to the Jewish rabbis,
right?
Zionism in Israel goes directly against Jewish diaspora, because Jews, according to Judaism, and according to the rabbis, Jews were exiled for not heeding the word of God, or Yahweh, right? They didn't listen to Yahweh, so Yahweh exiled them, and they are forbidden from gathering and forming a Jewish state. Jews are not allowed to have a Jewish state. That's not my opinion. That's what Judaism says, right? So because I say that, because if I say Jews aren't allowed to have a Jewish state, Israel should not exist, everybody freaks on me saying, oh, you're anti-Semitic and you hate Jews. And it's like, it's Jewish rabbis that are saying that. I'm an atheist. Like, I have no religious skin in the game. It's not my opinion. That's what Judaism says. That's what the Jewish rabbis say.
Okay, Brett, I'm gonna move on. Thanks for coming on the show. I hope you'll come back.
Hey, yeah, it's been a decent discussion. I would just, I'd like to see you not be quite so ingrained in the Zionist narratives and realize that there are bigger pictures at play. So that would be wonderful. But I do appreciate the chance to come up and have a conversation, and it was a nice one as well. It was not, you weren't yelling at each other, calling names and all that crap. So I very much appreciate that.
Okay.
And having reasonable discussion is important. So
yeah. Thanks, man. I'll talk to you another time. Okay. Take care, bro.
So
okay. Peace out. Bye-bye. So you might wonder, Luke, how would you explain his diametrical perspectives from your own? And there's a very simple explanation that's quite an adaptive frame to take in life. That is, he has a different hero system from me. That's it. I have a hero system. There's a large leap of faith in my hero system. I inherit almost all of my hero system from my community, which is Orthodox Judaism. So my community has one hero system. He comes from a different community. He has a different hero system. And we all need a hero system to stave off that feeling that our lives don't matter. And so we subscribe to something that feels eternal. And you might ask, 40, is your pulse racing? Is your blood pressure skyrocketing? Hearing the diametrically opposing perspective from your own on something that is so precious to you, the Jewish state of Israel. And to the best of my knowledge, my pulse is not racing and my blood pressure is not skyrocketing, because I recognize that different people have different hero systems. There's a fascinating and lengthy and well-written related Wikipedia entry on Zionist anti-Semitism. And initially, right, it sounds contradictory, right? Zionism, that's the Jewish thing. It's that Jews deserve to return to their ancestral homeland of Zion. It's Jewish nationalism. How could there be Zionist anti-Semitism? But there is, and there's a terrific Wikipedia entry. So there's a strong link between Zionism and anti-Semitism, right? I don't like the expression anti-Semitism because it's too highfalutin. I'm just a fair dinkum bloke from Australia, right? These big city, these city slicker, these book learning terms like anti-Semitism, they're just too sophisticated for a humble country bloke such as myself, right? I would prefer anti-Jewish, right? It's just so much simpler. But I have to work with the language as it is used. So I will use the expression anti-Semites and anti-Semitism when I have to. I don't like it. I would rather just say anti-Jewish, right? I will admit that there are times when there are intense conflicts between Jews and Arabs that I am liable to some anti-Arab sentiments. Not proud of that part of myself. I'm not embarrassed by it either, but it's there. Right? At times, I have anti-Christian sentiments. My father was a Christian theologian and evangelist, and I have some emotional baggage with regard to my relationship with my father that, under some circumstances, predisposes me to anti-Christian prejudice. There are times that I follow the news and I have anti-Muslim prejudice. There are times I have prejudice and negative feelings towards all sorts of out-groups. I don't celebrate that part of myself. I'm not ashamed of it. It's just there. So I'm going to use language as it is used by people outside of myself. So let's go to this thoughtful Wikipedia entry, Zionist anti-Semitism. So both Zionism and anti-Semitism share one basic aim. That's the negation of the Jewish diaspora, the existence of Jews in non-Jewish states. So in 1895, Theodor Herzl making the case for Zionism, and he supported the emigration of Jews from non-Jewish countries to Zion so that they could create their own space. And he says anti-Semites will become our most defendable friends. And the Nazis, prior to World War II, gave considerable assistance to Jews who wanted to take all their financial assets and move to Palestine. And the Nazis made that possible for thousands of Jews who lived in Germany. Early Zionists created a new image of the new Jew, or the Hebrew, and they contrasted this new Jew, or the Hebrew, as against the Yid, and they gave a negative caricature of European Jews, right? And they used language similar to that of anti-Semites. A lot of Israeli iconography, photography, movies, right, employ classic, right, Nazi tropes. My God. So the Russian-born Jewish scholar Zev Jabotinsky, and I'm probably a Jabotinskiite, right? I'm pretty friendly to his brand of revisionist Zionism, and Zev Jabotinsky gave up his career as a poet to devote himself to his version of Zionism. And he wrote, our starting point is to take the typical Yid of today, meaning the European Jew, and to imagine his diametrical opposite, that the Yid, the European Jew of today, is ugly, sickly, lacks decorum. We shall endow the real image of the Hebrew with masculine beauty. My God, he sounds like a Nazi. The Yid is trodden upon and easily frightened, and therefore the Hebrew ought to be proud and independent. One major difference that the people closest to me noticed as I began taking Alexander technique lessons and eventually enrolled in January 2009 at an Alexander training school and started studying the Alexander technique every day, is that I became less nervous, less frightened. It used to be, there was a time there, 2007, 2008, where it was painful for me to walk down a busy street because I just kept seeing in my mind's eye all these car accidents about to happen. Like, that's how neurotic and anxious and afraid I was. And you will find some of my videos where I am coming primarily out of a place of fear. There are way too many times, perhaps, I am just overcome by feeling small and weak in a big, scary world. So therefore, because the Yid is trodden upon and easily frightened, the Hebrew ought to be proud and independent. The Yid is despised by all. Therefore, the Hebrew ought to charm all. So sometimes in my life, I have felt like Jesus, despised by all, smitten, abused by men. For your transgressions, I am suffering. The Yid, and other times I feel like, oh my God, I can charm everybody. So a lot of people who absolutely hated me, within 2 minutes at times, I was able to charm them. And 5 minutes later, the woman is sitting on my lap. I remember there was this adult video magazine startup in late 1998, and I wrote about them becoming a competitor to Adult Video News, which was the one trade publication in the adult video industry. And this is something I wrote on my lookforward.com blog. And then at a party in January 1999 at the Consumer Electronics Show, I met the people that I'd been writing about, and they said, how could you write all these lies about us? We're a consumer publication. We have no interest in competing with AVN. We're not a trade publication. You're completely wrong. And 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, this very angry woman was very happily sitting on my lap, and we were getting on great. So there have been times when 40 has been charming. I'd like to think it has something to do with something my father said, that I change my mind more easily than anybody he's known. And I like to think it's fairly easy for me to say, oh man, I was just completely wrong about that. My God, what an idiot I was. Because when I look at things that I've said and done in the past, I think, oh my God, what a complete idiot I was. And I'm able to recognize that and see that, not hate myself for it. I was doing the best I could at the time with the tools that I had. Now I know better and I can do better. So when I was doing my 4-step inventory, right, why do I feel resentment? Okay, I feel resentment that this rabbi asked me to leave his synagogue. There's an example. What parts of myself did this affect? Well, when the rabbi asked me to leave the synagogue, it hurt my self-esteem. It hurt my romantic opportunities. It hurt my social standing. It hurt my economic opportunities. It made me feel less safe and less secure in the world. Okay, what role did I play in my own misfortune? I was writing things on my blogs that were incompatible with the religious community and the rabbis that I ostensibly wanted to be close to. So what could I do differently? Number one, if I want the freedom to say things that are going to outrage a particular religious community, right, I should have rachmanus. I should have mercy on that community and not try to join with it. If I join a community, then I have a responsibility to not detract from the cohesion and the holiness of that community. And so I am profoundly influenced by the Orthodox Jewish communities that I have joined. And so since late 2007, I have increasingly desired to restrain what I say publicly so as to not cause pain, dysfunction, a diminishment of the presence of God or holiness in my religious community. So that's what I would do differently now that I know better. Right? The Yid has accepted submission, therefore the Hebrew ought to learn how to command. The Yid wants to conceal his identity from strangers, therefore the Hebrew should look the world straight in the eye and declare, I am a Hebrew. Okay, we do not tend to use good discretion with those with whom we extend way too much trust.
True trust only occurs when someone is trustworthy of you giving them the trust. I can't tell you how many times I've seen someone try to trust someone who is not trustworthy, and then they get mad at the person for betraying their trust. But isn't it at least foolish for us to trust someone who cannot trust themselves? You see, that's why I said I think that we give away trust way too easily.
I don't think he gets into the reason we do this, right? We do this seemingly maladaptive thing because we get a payoff, right? There is a biochemical rush that I know I have often felt in the past, and I assume that you have also felt, right? There is a biochemical rush. There is a biochemical payoff from feeling victimized and betrayed. And this is why we consistently act in a way that seems maladaptive.
Because we feel this pressure that you should be a trusting person. And yet, if you trust someone that's not trustworthy, you're not being loving. You're setting yourself up for a terrible disappointment and for some incredible tragedy. Number 5. Unreasonable expectation is that since we are adults, we should be able to discuss as adults and negotiate our differences. Well, to negotiate your differences in a good way, where you're coming up with what I'd like to consider as a win-win solution or a mutually satisfying solution, means that you're going to have to be able to present to the other person what's important to you and respect that person's differences. And you can see, based on what I've said already, the infrastructure for doing that is not there unless we do a hell of a lot of work on ourselves. So the reality of this is few of us really know how to negotiate in a mutually satisfying way. We are stuck in a win-lose drama in which we either relentlessly strive to stay on the winning end of the proposition or resign and become the perennial losers. That's the reality of it. It's going to take a lot of growing up and a lot of what we call grinding. And that's the way that we think about struggling with our differences, is two people come together and they grind. Now, that means that you're going to need to be willing to feel tension in the relationship. And that's another thing, in addition to everything I've just said about what makes this hard, is the fact that we want to avoid being uncomfortable.
It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of love, guys. It's going to take a lot of love. Man, Chrome is really moving slow. It's going to take a lot of love to change the way things are. It's going to take a lot of love, or we won't get too far. So if you look in my direction and we don't see eye to eye, my heart needs protection, and so do I. It's going to take a lot of love to get us through the night. It's going to take a lot of love to make things work out right. I still haven't received my invitation from America's Got Talent. I don't know why. Why is there this black ball against my opportunity to appear on America's Got Talent? There's some awful conspiracy that's preventing me from appearing on America's Got Talent. Hey, Luke Ford, why do you declare the same confession each time in your live streams? It's no longer a confession. Also, your confession is a lie. You converted to Judaism to maximize your free speech. You can now freely talk about Jews who have off limits, to talk about post-World War II, to build an alternative identity distinct from your Seventh-day Adventist pastor father who you disliked. If your confession were true, then you'd be happily married to a Jewish woman right now. But your stubborn refusal to marry within the community is telling. Consider it in the liberating, brute, truth-exposing, logical formulation. You can do YY, but you cannot do YY. You can put all your efforts into converting to Judaism, but you cannot quit streaming about news, repeating the same core talking points each time. Ooh. Okay, that's painful. And so let's see, what's the excerpt that she's referring to here?
In Israel and Hamas, the Israeli...
So I have a confession to make, and I'm not ashamed of the following, and I'm not proud of it. But I think very little about Arab suffering or Palestinian suffering. And it's not... Okay, so why do I declare the same confession each time in my live stream? Because I think it's important that people should be able to see at a glance where I'm coming from. So let's say you stumbled upon my stream for the first time. I want you to know that I have substantial biases. I am a Zionist. Right? I strongly identify with the Jewish state of Israel. And when the Jewish state of Israel is in war against Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and other forces, my sympathies lie entirely with the Jewish state. And this intense emotional and social attachment that I have to the Jewish state blinds me from bestowing equal amounts of empathy for the enemies of the Jewish state. Right? I have substantial biases. Right? I have blinders on. Right? When you bind with other people, when you form intense in-group identities, you also, these ties bind you and blind you. I am blind to many other perspectives. So that's why I give the confession. Now, is my confession a lie? I can't see it clearly. Right, most of my friends are Orthodox Jews. Do you think I'm lying when I say that? I have been blessed to find those parts of Orthodox Judaism that are fairly tolerant of the topics that I discuss on my live streams. I receive very little pushback to things that I say on my live streams. I'm not an important commentator in Jewish life. Big Jews do not follow me on Twitter. I'm not some influential spokesman on Jewish issues. I have carved out a niche where I can talk about the things that I want to talk about, but I have a sense of the communities that are most important to me, to the personal connections that are most important to me, and I will put a higher priority on some of those connections than I will on my free speech to say anything that I want. So I restrain the things that I say to maintain my most important friendships. I do not give you 100% of everything that I think. On the other hand, I am willing to sacrifice some tension in some of my relationships, and I am willing to sacrifice some degree of internal cohesion and intense in-group identity for the sake of freedom of speech. So I give up some, deliberately choose to give up some freedom of speech in exchange for some group cohesion and identity and comfort. And I'm willing to give up some group identity, cohesion, and comfort for an extension of free speech. So intense in-group belonging and free speech are diametrically opposed. The more intensely you belong and cohere and fit in with your community, right, the less freedom of speech you're going to have. So I make sacrifices on both ends. So let me go back to, let's see. Right, you converted to Judaism to maximize your free speech. Well, I do love the way that Judaism achieves a balance between individual freedom and the good of the community. Right, I love the way that Judaism has evolved ways of balancing those two things. So I love the amount of free speech that I have within Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism is not just some repressive series of rules that minutely prescribe how you talk and how you act, right? There is considerable flexibility within that system. So I enjoy the balance that is arrived at in Orthodox Judaism. And there are also many Orthodox communities where I would not be a good fit. So not every Orthodox synagogue would be thrilled to have me as a member. On the other hand, I have not experienced being expelled or not counted in a minyan for a long, long time, right? Over 15 years. So there are freedoms that are available to you within Orthodox Judaism, but one needs good judgment. You wanted to build an alternative identity distinct from your Seventh-day Adventist pastor, father who you disliked. Yeah, I'm sure that's right. If your confession were true, then you'd be happily married to a Jewish woman right now, but your stubborn refusal to marry within the community is telling. Yeah, so I probably got blind spots here, right? Often other people will see me far more clearly than I do. Often other people who I consider evil, and that does not apply to Curious Gazelle, but there are people that I've considered who I just think are awful, awful people. But then I'd have to admit that they would see me far more accurately than I did, right? I had, enemies that I used to feud with back in the heyday of my blogging. And when I'd read to my therapist some of the most cutting comments about me, my therapist would laugh and laugh because they were so accurate. You can put all your efforts into converting to Judaism, but you cannot quit streaming about news, repeating the same core talking points each time. Right, so she probably sees me more clearly than I see myself. So I got blind spots. All right, here are some of her. Damn, I really don't like Chrome these days. Here's Luke Ford on the harsh reality that we humans tend to empathize with those in our in-group and not out-group. For Luke, his in-group of Jews. In my own understanding of Luke Ford, I personally believe he is an example of someone who is empathizing heavily with what is an out-group because his true in-group, white Anglos, particularly Australian Seventh-day Adventists, failed him. I've experienced this as well. You were brought up in a Muslim household, and you then discover that all the people you're supposed to officially not feel for, Jews and his working-class white men, are actually good people. You naturally begin to feel empathy towards those out-groups. In this way, empathy is rationally acquired upon freedom from one's mob rather than a tribal-based instinct. You also know more about your own in-group, in my case, Muslims, Pakistanis, South Asians, and so you have exposure to their misdeeds and hypocrisy too. It begins to grate on you. Therefore, it becomes easier to empathize with others than your own. It might even become second nature. In my deeper psychological analysis of Luke Ford, I believe he has adopted Judaism to ultimately secure the right to a free speech that is beyond good and evil. Certainly, I believe that we should have room to discuss the world apart from good and evil, that just trying to understand how the world works is a worthy endeavor in and of itself, separate from moral concerns. Luke wants to be able to talk freely about Jews without the allegations of anti-Semitism. So Luke empathizing with outgroups, because Luke's empathy for that outgroup then is largely performative. That's fascinating. Let's hear.
But later change his estimates. Czechoslovakia, Greece, or other countries. We executed about 400,000 Hungarian Jews alone at Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. Hirst would later change his estimates, but he would live a double life. Despite being brutal and barbaric inside of his death camp, he would finish at the end of the day and would come home to his villa where he would live with his wife and children. But what did his wife know?
All right, this is the powerful part of the movie. It just shows the completely ordinary lives that the commandant of Auschwitz and his wife carried on. And this is true, all right? We don't tend to care very much about outgroups, right? 29,000 Gazans approximately have died as a result of the Israeli bombing and incursion of Gaza. And I don't lose sleep about it because my group, Jews, are in this life and death struggle, it seems like, with Palestinians. And so I just don't care that much about the suffering of outgroups. And this is the human tendency. We primarily care about our own comfort and our own group. And we just don't care much about outgroups.
And what does she know about the evils of
Okay.
Czechoslovakia, Greece?
Hey, stop it. All right, let me see some other critiques here from Curious Gazelle. Here, 40 reacts to the Spirituality podcast reaction to Joe Rogan's podcast with Chris Rufo on the importance of religion. I've come to a successful characterization of Luke Ford's predictable patterns. I've isolated his core analytical paradigms and reference point. The following 8-minute clip is an excellent condensation, which you can hear all of the nature versus nurture, social networks, Carl Schmitt's concept of the political myth, functionalism versus what's true, religious functionalism, methodologies for ascertaining the truth, gut instinct, the knee-jerk versus appealing to experts, hero systems, name-dropping Dennis Prager and Richard Spencer. Luke much prefers analyzing an academic analysis of a more gut instinct pseudo-religious analysis. This content is the primary analysis. Ford enjoys showing a sophisticated pushback against academic analysis because, as a religious believer, he sees its limits. He understands religious people well, but he tends toward a dismissal of the knee-jerk ways of the primary analysis. Ford is the tertiary analyst. Luke Ford constantly refers back to these two academic podcasts, Con Spirituality and Decoding the Gurus. They're both left-wing podcasts. He also refers back to Steve Saylor's appearances because Saylor offers rigorous secular academic analysis. Do you get tired of me confessing my biases on every single stream? Do you get tired of me repeating my delusions? Do you tire of me lying to you? Do you think that Curious Gazelle sees me more accurately than I see myself? Am I playing some double, triple game here? Am I conscious of lying to you? So I'm thinking right now about Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. If Bibi Netanyahu was to say explicitly what he's doing, what he plans to do, he would, one, have lost vital American support that he could not afford to do without, particularly under the Biden administration. And two, he would have lost his right-wing partners in his governing coalition. So he would have been a double loser if he had said the truth since October 7th. So Bibi has been playing double, triple games to both maintain relations with the Biden administration because he vitally needs America's support and arms, and at the same time, he vitally needs right-wing groups to maintain his governing coalitions. So we're all often placed in positions where it is absolutely essential that we duplicitous and that we are not fully forthcoming, because if we are forthcoming, it will be destructive to those parts of our life that is most important to me. So I venerate optimizing for truth when discussing public affairs. And because I venerate optimizing for truth in discussing public affairs, I optimize for truthfully recognizing all the incentives that we have to lie and dissemble in certain instances, and also to recognize that we are often self-deceived, or we just have blind spots, or we don't see the world as it is. Rather, we tend to see the world as we are. So, some thoughtful challenges from Curious Gazelle. And I'm not sure I'm capable right now, live on the air, with an enormous audience of 16 people watching me live on YouTube. Not sure I'm quite able to pivot to fully addressing them. But there is one thing I do know. It's going to take a lot of love to change the way things are. It's going to take a lot of love, or we won't get too far. So if you look in my direction and we don't see eye to eye, my heart needs protection, and so do I. It's going to take a lot of love to get us through this live stream. It's going to take a lot of love to make things work out right in Palestine. So if you're out there waiting, I hope you show up soon. You know, I need relating, not solitude. That's beautiful. Lot of Love is the song. Nicolette Lawson. Lot of Love peaked at number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 for a week in February of 1979, and the song was written by Neil Young. Let me take a short break to gather my emotional and mental resources.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. This week, as the business and political elites gathered in Davos, Switzerland, what did they try to accomplish, and what are the odds of success? Plus, President Trump pledges to deport unlawful immigrants by the hundreds of thousands. We look at what that could mean for the economy. And the rapid growth of non-alcoholic beer. What is driving it, and how far could it go? But we start with the tragedy of the Los Angeles fires, measured first and foremost in the lives lost and the homes destroyed. It's much more than a story about money, but it is also about money. And sadly, only the most recent chapter of a story we brought you in December about how much we are willing to pay to protect what we value. Then it was losses from hurricanes in Florida. Now it's about the even greater losses from fires in Los Angeles.
It's a lot of hard work building a business, and seeing this, it's tough.
And we could see fireballs just rolling up the street.
Really scary when you can see the flames coming up over the houses. It looked like pandemonium.
I'm a retired firefighter, so I know the dangers. When it's a wind-driven fire, there's nothing now, very little we can do.
It's definitely tough. There's a lot of people who don't have insurance.
As those that lost their homes try to figure out how, or even if, they can rebuild, they'll be turning to their insurance companies. J.P. Morgan estimates the insured damages covered could exceed $20 billion, which would make these the costliest wildfires in U.S. history. So could this push California's insurance market to its limit?
This is speculative and shifting day by day, so we're not sure exactly where it's going to land. But the insurance industry that have looked into this and looked at the impact on their book are not running for the hills.
Jerry Theodoro is director of the Finance, Insurance, and Trade Policy Program at R Street Institute, a D.C.-based think tank that promotes free markets. Like Theodoro, S&P Global Ratings says the insured losses from the LA fires should be manageable. In part, that's because it's not just the primary insurance companies bearing the losses, it's also the reinsurance companies that back them up.
Estimated insured losses are $20 to $30 billion, and reinsurance is going to take a big piece of that, risk that's spread all over the world. Bermuda, London, continental Europe, the Far East, reinsurance companies taking a piece of the pain.
Okay, let's get back to Zionist anti-Semitism. So another American academic writes here, anti-Semitism and pro-Zionism have never been exclusive. Advocates for a Jewish state enlisted stereotypes of Jews to further their cause. Theodor Herzl appealed to European leaders that Zionism would resolve the Jewish question by sending Jews elsewhere. Now, the Jewish question was a primary question in 19th century Europe, but I don't think today most people regard the Jewish question as something of primary interest, right? Most Americans don't question whether Jews are worthy of American citizenship. What percentage of the American population would you say seriously question whether Jews are worthy of American citizenship? I would think probably less than 10%. So when you look at the writings of various European Zionists like Herzl and Max Nordau, They are littered with descriptions of European Jews as parasites, as social diseases, germs, aliens. And these anti-Semitic views flowed quite logically from Zionism's basic assumptions about Jews. Zionists accepted the 19th century view that anti-Semitism, in fact, all racial difference, was a permanent feature of human nature, right? And now we know better. Now we know that we're all just one big family, and if we just learn to love one another, that all these differences would disappear. It was pointless to struggle against it. It was pointless to struggle against racial difference. My God, think how primitive they were back in the 19th century. They thought that racial differences were a permanent feature of human nature. Thank God we have graduated from that level of pathology. Jews have often been hostile to Zionism because Zionism called for a retreat from the struggle against anti-Semitism. American historian Daniel Pipes notes that many anti-Semites favor a Jewish state as a means of reducing the Jewish population in their midst. So German journalist Wilhelm Marr, the anti-Jewish agitator who coined the term anti-Semitism, was an early example of a pro-Zionist anti-Semite. He supported Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine as beneficial for both German Jews and for German anti-Semites. Pipes describes this variety of anti-Semitism as less common to conspiratorial or anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. And we have political theorist Michael Walzer. He says the first anti-Zionists in the 19th century were Orthodox Jews who believed that Zionism was a heretical ideology. They argued that the return of Jews to the land of Israel and the establishment of a state should only occur after the Messiah came. And until then, Jews must accept living in diaspora and defer to non-Jewish rulers while waiting for redemption. So this is pretty much the majority Orthodox position prior to 1948 and the establishment of the Jewish state. So after the concrete establishment of a Jewish state in 1948, most Orthodox rabbis ceased to be anti-Zionist. Zionists were usually secular. They despised the perceived passivity of Orthodox Jews with such passion that Orthodox Jews often refer to them as anti-Semites. So various anti-Zionist Orthodox rabbis said, "The Goyim in America let us be Jews. They do not ruin our Talmud Torah," meaning our Talmudic academies. "They do not reform our schools. They do not ridicule Jews who go to mikveh and keep the commandments. It is enough for me to be in the diaspora with the Goyim. I have no need to be in Eretz Yisrael, right, under Jews who are anti-Semitic Zionists." And on the opposite end of the Jewish political spectrum, there was a similar conclusion reached by liberal assimilationist Jews. So British Liberal Party politician Edward Montagu, the sole Jewish member of the Lloyd George ministry and an ardent anti-Zionist, he was passionately opposed to the Balfour Declaration on the grounds that it was a capitulation to anti-Semitic bigotry with its suggestion that Palestine was the natural destination of the Jews. I just had a revelation. So when I say that I don't spend a great deal of time or much time at all thinking about Palestinian suffering, that is true, but I am glad that there are people who care deeply about Palestinian suffering, and there is no part of me that believes that the Palestinians are somehow less human or less worthy of empathy and compassion than my own in-group Jews. Right? I just recognize that in times of conflict, that my own emotional loyalties primarily go to my own team, and I expect other people's loyalties to primarily go to their team. But it doesn't raise my blood pressure when I talk to people who are anti-Zionist and pro-Palestine. So these liberal Jews were passionately opposed to the Balfour Declaration on the grounds it was a capitulation to anti-Semitic bigotry when it suggested that Palestine was the natural destination of the Jews. Another anti-Zionist said anti-Semitism is the essence of Zionism, and he would label Jewish anti-Semites to describe Jews who were Zionists. He attacked German Jewish self-hatred. Right? He criticized the self-hating aspects of German Jewish society and German Zionism. He lampoons members of the Viennese literary crowd, the Jewish literary crowd. In his work, A Crown for Zion, he suggests that in attempting to assimilate, German Jews have imbibed the stereotypes and beliefs in racial power structures pervasive through German society. He describes assimilationists, Zionists, and Theodor Herzl in particular as Jewish anti-Semites in the same vein as the Aryan anti-Semites for their common desire to expel Jews from European culture. And then an author, Sarah Levy, writes for Socialist Worker. Damn, my subscription has lapsed to Socialist Worker. She wrote in 2017, early Zionists partnered with a rabidly anti-Semitic British ruling class to secure funding for their colonial project in Palestine. And Joseph Massad wrote for Al Jazeera, it is Israel's claim that it represents and speaks for all Jews that are the most anti-Semitic claims of all. He said that Jewish opponents of Zionism understand that Gentile Europeans shared the precepts of anti-Semitism and that Zionists and anti-Semites held a shared belief in the expulsion of Jews from Europe, and that most pre-war European Jews resisted the anti-Semitic basis of Zionism, and that European ruling powers typically supported the anti-Semitic program of Zionism.
Over the course of my talk is that a lot of times when we talk and think about censorship and what to do about censorship, we focus a lot on things like law and policies. The argument that I want to try to make here is that laws and policies are probably not going to get us as much progress as we might think or hope, because the main challenge that we face in many of our institutions of knowledge production is fundamentally a cultural problem. So to start with, to kind of frame this issue, there are lots of polling and survey data that suggest that academics tend to be more likely to censor others, more likely to self-censor than most other Americans. And this is especially true.
And it's not just academics, all right? The more elite you are, the more you favor censorship of social media, while your average American is staunchly opposed to this.
This is true even if you look at the general level, but when you go to concrete cases, because everyone supports academic freedom in principle, but then when you're like, hey, would you support this person being able to talk? A lot, you get the numbers shrink a lot. So this is from an article that I published on my website from a study that was done by Cato Institute that looked at people at colleges and universities versus people in the general public. And you can see that academics are more likely to view most things as hate speech, a broader class of things as hate speech than the general public. They're more likely to self-censor on basically any topic than the general public. They're more
Okay, let's get back to this Wikipedia entry on Zionist anti-Semitism. Racism between Jews is common in Israel. I would wager that racism between different groups is common everywhere. In 2023, a video circulated on social media showing Likud activist Itzhak Zaka shouting, "May you burn in hell" at protesters and disrespecting Holocaust victims by adding, "I am proud of the 6 million that were burned. I wish that another 6 million would be burned." And he referred to leftists as traitor. He was then removed from the Likud party under the orders of Bibi Netanyahu. In the United States, left-wing Jews have accused mainstream Zionists of using anti-Semitic tropes against progressive Jews and of allying with Christian and conservative anti-Semites. So The Intercept said the Zionist organization Democratic Majority for Israel employed anti-Semitic tropes during the 2020 election after this group released attack ads criticizing the progressive Jewish California politician Sarah Jacobs. The ads emphasized her wealthy background. They portrayed her fortune and her privileged life as making her out of touch with ordinary Americans. The Intercept said that the imagery and language employed by the ads was reminiscent of common anti-Semitic tropes, and noted the organization had previously endorsed wealthy non-Jewish candidates. In August 2022, the left-wing Jewish organization If Not Now tweeted that AIPAC was anti-Semitic after AIPAC said that George Soros has a long history of backing anti-Israel groups and that J Street and George Soros work to undermine pro-Israel Democrats. If Not Now tweeted that AIPAC was not a Jewish organization, that it did not represent Jews, and it promoted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about George Soros, and that AIPAC, my God, had become part of the anti-Semitic far right. The March for Israel held in Washington, D.C. in November 2023 featured the Christians United for Israel founder, evangelical pastor John Hagee as a speaker. No Jewish clergy were invited to speak. This pastor has sparked controversy. John Hagee, has sparked controversy in the past for claiming that Jews were responsible for the Holocaust by disobeying God, that God had sent Hitler, and that Hitler was of Jewish descent. And some liberal rabbis wrote that Hagee's presence was entirely predictable for those familiar with the long-standing alliance between Zionists and anti-Semites, and that supporting Israel doesn't automatically make someone an ally to the Jewish people. Next entry here in this Wikipedia essay, right-wing and Christian pro-Zionist anti-Semitism. Young Israeli activists increasingly recognize that their safety depends on linking the fight against anti-Semitism to other social justice struggles. And they're decrying the weaponization of anti-Semitism. My God, did you know that there are groups out there who use anti-Semitism as a trope to promote their particular ideology? My God, is nothing sacred? Have you no decency that you would take a holy topic like anti-Semitism and use it to promote your particular ideology? Makes me sick when people do this. My God. Shocking. Did you know that critical voices are silenced within Zionism when Zionism coalesces with white nationalist and Christian Zionist anti-Semitism? Did you know that the Norwegian far-right domestic terrorist Anders Behring Breivik was both an anti-Semitic neo-Nazi and a strong supporter of the State of Israel? He was an extreme version of Zionist anti-Semitism. He was anti-Semitic and pro-Israel because in Breivik's view, the Israeli state is a first line of defense against Muslim expansion. Breivik believed that France and the United Kingdom have a Jewish problem due to their large Jewish populations, whereas the rest of Western European does not. And Breivik believed that Jews are okay as long as there aren't too many of them living in the diaspora. New York Times journalist Michelle Goldberg, who wrote 2 articles about me back in 1999, she referred to Breivik as an ardent Zionist who has nothing but contempt for the majority of Jews. She argued that his embrace of Israel, far from unique, is just the latest sign that in European politics, guys, fascism and an aggressive Zionism increasingly go together. She cites Islamophobia as a commonality between the State of Israel and European white nationalists. Well, one thing I notice is that having a common enemy is a really good way to bond. And alliances and friendships aren't necessarily forever. As situations change, alliances tend to shift with them. That we all have interests, but the best way to pursue and to protect your interests will change when the situation changes. And here we have a historian writing in Counterpunch that it's false to equate all anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism because of the existence of Zionists who are anti-Semites, such as Alfred Balfour, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, Glenn Beck, Richard Spencer, and Donald Trump are all Zionist anti-Semites, according to this professor. Next entry, desire to expel the Jewish diaspora. Richard S. Levy, a scholar of anti-Semitism, wrote that anti-Semites found Zionism useful because Zionism provided anti-Semitic Zionists with a justification as to why Jews who are living in the diaspora should be expelled from the societies where they had lived for centuries. Coerced immigration to the land of Israel appealed to anti-Semites because it provided them with a solution to the Jewish question. Arthur Balfour was opposed to a British mandate over Palestine, but supported Zionism as a method to reduce the alien entity of Jews in Gentile societies, whose presence he considered destabilizing. Why on earth would he think that? Was there ever any empirical evidence in that direction? I'm shocked. Barry Weiss considers Lord Balfour as a historical anti-Semitic Zionist. Balfour was instrumental in the creation of a Zionist state. He did so because he did not want Jews emigrating from Eastern Europe to England, many of whom were escaping pogroms to immigrate to Britain. So if people are in trouble in a different part of the world, it doesn't mean that you necessarily want to admit them to your state. if their admission is not in the interest of your state. I would expect people to operate immigration policy on the basis of what is best for their particular nation state. Did you know that Lord Balfour supported the Aliens Act of 1905, which restricted Jewish immigration into Britain? And she cites this as an example of his anti-Semitism. Well, the major Jewish organizations in the 1930s wanted to limit Jewish immigration to Britain because they were afraid that too much immigration of Jews to Britain would be a spur for anti-Semitism. And I am not aware of any non-Jewish countries where once the Jewish proportion of the population reached 5% or more, that it was not accompanied by a great deal of dislocation and stress and threats to internal cohesion and social trust. Polish government of the 1930s supported Jewish immigration to Israel for reasons similar to Balfour. They were staunch supporters of the Zionists. At the same time, they were adapting increasingly anti-Jewish domestic policies. They actively encouraged emigration to Palestine because it decreased the population of Polish Jews. The Polish government's attitudes towards Zionism and Jewish emigration implied that Jews were superfluous, alien, even a destructive element. During the 1920s and 30s, the Jewish socialists in Poland were vocal critics of this anti-Semitic Zionism. They argued that Zionist promotion of emigration and cooperation with the Polish government strengthened anti-Semitic forces within Polish society. You have a French Jewish journalist who noted that the anti-Semitic right-wing politician and Nazi collaborator Xavier Vallet said that Jews would never integrate into France and that they had to go to Israel. So probably up to World War II, substantial part of the French and German population believed that Jews could never be true Frenchmen or true Germans. I don't think this widespread view is as common today, that Christian attitudes towards Jews considerably softened after the Holocaust. Members of the French far right, anti-Semitic Zionists, because they want French Jews to emigrate to Israel. And then did you know about the anti-Semitic attitudes of the American far right? Right-wing evangelical Christians in the U.S. are often vocally Zionist while holding anti-Semitic attitudes towards Jews. This is too awful.
Likely to support the censorship of almost anything in the general public. One stereotypical exception to this rule is that academics tend to be more tolerant of flag burning and saying America is evil. But shy of that, on almost anything else, the academics are more likely to support the censorship of others and more likely to censor themselves. And this is striking, it's actually kind of wild, because for most other workers in the United States, they basically have no rules at all protecting freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of association, privacy, any of that. Even First Amendment, basic First Amendment rules don't apply in many workplaces. There's some great books on this by Elizabeth Anderson and Sohrab Ahmari. So at public universities, we're protected by the First Amendment. Even at private universities, they typically have rules that robustly protect freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, and so on. So academics actually have a lot more formal freedom than basically anyone else in society, but we're also a lot more censorious and more likely to self-censor. So that's an interesting puzzle. Legally, students and faculty are very free. As David French noted in this article and in a recent talk, a lot of the big battles for free speech have already been waged and won. Things like speech codes in most colleges and universities have been rolled back. Even newer innovations like DEI statements and things like this are being actively rolled back. And in a recent talk that I joined David at, he mentioned that, running these kinds of free speech cases, they overwhelmingly win when they get to court. It's mostly you just show up to court, you collect your W, you collect your paycheck, and you go to the next one. They overwhelmingly win. in terms of laws and rules, academics in the United States are basically freer than they've ever been. They're freer than almost anyone else, any other type of worker in the United States, and they're freer than academics are in pretty much almost any other place in the world. In terms of our legal, actual freedoms, we have a ton of them, and they're expanding all the time, and when they go to court, when people try to violate those freedoms and you take them to court, they lose.
So I was shocked about 20 years ago when I read a simple observation that I hadn't considered, that the history of English literature was a history of Christian literature. And then I thought, oh yeah, Christianity is a profound background and sometimes foreground theme through almost all the great works of English literature. And so it would make sense that departments that studied English literature would be heavily dominated by WASPs, and they wouldn't be thrilled to have Jews enter their departments. So both English literature and history were primarily dominated by WASPs, and Jews didn't make inroads until the 20th century. So I was shocked to find out it was not until 1939 that you had the first tenure-track Jew appointed a professor of English literature, and that was Lionel Trilling at Columbia University. And so I love a couple of books on this theme by Suzanne Klingenstein. So one is Jews in the American Academy, 1900 to 1940, The Dynamics of Intellectual Assimilation. And so she makes the point, the process of admission to English literature departments as professors, it was not some kind of unilateral act of consent, right? Both parties had to make compromises, right? So the guardians of Anglo-Saxon culture and Jews engaged in a complex give-and-take bilateral process between the two cultures. The majority gave more than it took, and it almost succeeded in remodeling the minority in its own image. So the early Jewish professors of English literature in American academic departments were highly assimilated, right? It wasn't until the 1960s that you would find academics with a strong Jewish identity and Jewish observance who would find tenure-track positions at American universities in the field of English literature. So we had a remodeling of Jewish intellectuals in the image of America. So if they wanted to succeed in the academy, they had to assimilate to Anglo-Saxon norms. And in the process, right, they had to restructure their thinking, right? They had to assimilate to Anglo-Saxon ideas of America, had to assimilate to its opposite, the gentility of English literature. And many of these Jewish intellectuals desired to assimilate because they felt themselves alienated from the Jewish world of their fathers, right? They were secular. They were not big fans of Orthodox Judaism. They were not observant of Jewish law. They didn't feel an emotional nor an intellectual attachment to traditional Judaism or to the traditional way of life. They looked up to Anglo-Saxon culture and they wanted a part of it. At the same time, they did not feel entirely released from the ties of Jewish tradition. So they were somewhat alienated from the Jewish tradition and from the dominant Anglo-Saxon elite. Now, from the perspective of many Gentiles, this is a chief asset of Jewish intellectuals, that they were alienated both from the dominant worldview and from their own tribal worldview. So there was a crisis in the world of Jewry after the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment meant challenging traditional Jewish ways of thinking. And so the Jewish Enlightenment went by the name of Haskalah, and it was primarily a movement of non-Orthodox Jews. When Jews have had a choice, Jews have usually chosen not to be Orthodox Jews. Now, in the middle to the late 19th century, some Jews found a way to hold on to their Orthodox Judaism and to also embrace much of the Haskalah, the secular Jewish Enlightenment. But that's quite a trick. So traditional Jewry was self-absorbed, wasn't particularly interested in the world outside of the tribe, and they were primarily text-centered, meaning they spent their intellectual energies on the Talmud and the rabbinic tradition, and they didn't make many contributions to the world of modern European intellectual life. So Jews who emigrated to America in the late 19th century came from centers of economic, social, and intellectual crisis. Their experience of home, of Judaism, and of Jewishness was one of rupture, breakup, and discontent. They experienced Judaism as a limitation, a dullness, and a despair. So those Jews who were of intellectual bent were quite ready to adopt new views that would transform their father's culture and make it compatible with the modern world, or that would just dissolve that traditional Jewish culture altogether. And so they would stage their own conquest of the American Academy. They would leave their father's world, but often they would find their minds being so thoroughly formed by Jewish thought that a complete intellectual restructuring was not possible. So they would interpret Gentile culture and English literature and the idea of America to fit their own intellectual grammar. So there was an encounter between these Jewish minds and the dominant Anglo-Saxon idea of America. So they would grapple with American philosophy or literature. And you'll find traces in their work of a dual redefinition. They are embarked on a redefinition of Judaism and Jewishness, remodeled in the light of an Anglo-Saxon conception of America. At the same time, they would reinterpret America to accommodate their Jewish intellectual grammar. So you see this particularly in the work of Leo Strauss. What essentially explains the work of Leo Strauss is that he wants to create a world that is friendly to Jews and Jewish nationalism, and he wants to limit the nationalisms of non-Jews to ensure that they are not unfriendly to Jews. And so who the hell are the West Coast Straussians? Right. Like the East Coast Straussians, right, in theory, they are neocons. But in practice, they tend to be quite populist and Trumpian, the West Coast Straussians, who are primarily based at Hillsdale University and at Claremont University in Southern California. Brian McClanahan is a big believer in federalism, a big believer in states' rights. He is a historian, and he is a contributor to Chronicles magazine, the primary intellectual journey for paleocons such as Paul Gottfried. So Brian McClanahan has frequently clashed with Yoram Hazony, with Michael Anton, with the West Coast Straussians, with Claremont University. Here's a video he did 2 years ago.
Very long expose on the Claremont Institute and the New York Times. And as I've said before, I subscribe to the New York Times, so you don't have to. But somebody sent this to me. I hadn't read it yet, but I sat down and read the piece, and I found it fascinating. First of all, the Claremont Institute is getting a lot of publicity because of its association with Donald Trump, right? The Trump administration. Of course, Michael Anton was in the Trump administration. He wrote the Flight 93 election book, and he's become very much of a darling on the conservative.
And Anton's also in the new administration, along with Julie Hartman.
Conservative circuit. And everyone knows, if you've listened to the show for some time, Anton and I had it out in Chronicles magazine last year about the meaning of American conservatism in some ways. Now, all of the Claremonters, for the most part, are very much opposed to the Southern tradition. They think it's the antithesis of America. They really do. I mean, this is...
So Brian McClanahan is a big fan of John Calhoun, who was a prominent intellectual and politician in America's South prior to the Civil War.
This is the basis of their political philosophy. The Southern tradition is the antithesis of America. Anton himself has spelled this out very clearly when he tries to persuade conservatives to distance themselves from John C. Calhoun, because Calhoun is somehow anti-American. Now, the Bob Elder book, Calhoun, which is titled American Heretic, right? That's the original title, American Heretic, does essentially say that Calhoun is certainly American, but he is considered to be heretical, that there is something about Calhoun that's heretical in American society, that he wasn't really American, he was something else. And I think all of this goes back to the 1850s Republican Party. This is why by Christopher Caldwell about Robert E.
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward here through 15 minutes of talk about John Calhoun.
It says, Harry Jaffa died in January 2015 at 96 and didn't live to witness the rise of Donald Trump. An emotional debate has ensued as to how Jaffa, who continued to write and argue well into his 80s, might have reacted to the events of the last few years. This spring, one of Jaffa's sons, Philip, who is 70, emailed me. He is adamant that the Claremont Institute has turned against his father's teachings. He cited an essay by Christopher Caldwell about Robert E. Lee that the Claremont Review ran last spring, which called Lee, quote, the moral force of half the nation. Now, this is interesting because here is Philip Jaffa, Harry Jaffa's son, saying, no. I mean, Jaffa would not have liked Robert E. Lee. He's right about that. Look, Jaffa was a Lincolnian. Jaffa thought he was like Alan Gelzo. I mean, South bad, right? I mean, really, at the end of the day. Now, Jaffa and Bradford, Mel Bradford, had this long, ongoing debate about these things where Jaffa came up with this wacky idea that somehow equality is conservative. And this is where Bradford just took him to task. And Jaffa really had no response. In my opinion, Jaffa's response is milquetoast. It's ridiculous. Jaffa did support Mel Bradford for his appointment to the Reagan administration, while all the other neocons and Straussians jumped on Bradford and said he can't do it. And of course, Reagan withdrew the nomination, or the potential nomination. Jaffa did support Bradford. But, I mean, here's the thing. I don't think Jaffa would have supported any position that had Robert E. Lee as somewhat of a conservative. But Lee was conservative. Lee was. The whole Lee family was conservative. If you follow Hazoni's idea that the Federalists were all American conservatives, that's what Lee was. He was a Federalist. His father was Washington's right-hand man. His father was beaten up by Jeffersonians. And then had to go and convalesce somewhere just to try to regain his health after he was almost killed. So Lee would have represented everything about American conservatism. And he sided with Virginia. But you see, he's not a Lincolnian. He's not that kind of conservative. He's not one of these 19th century Republicans, which doesn't make him a conservative. This is just lunacy. It's lunacy. And this is where I will give the Claremont Institute credit. I think Anton actually pointed this out somewhere. Well, we did run this piece on Robert E. Lee that was very complimentary of Lee. Okay. That's good. Now go all the way, right? Ditch Lincoln, and you've got it. You've got it. If the Claremont people would just ditch Jaffa and Lincoln, they would get it. They would be on it, right? But they won't do it because they can't. Because they know that if they don't, this is where, the piece talks about how limited Claremont has been, and they figured out that, well, if we're Lincoln, Lincoln, we have Lincoln scholars. We're Lincoln. We're Declaration, Proposition H. All this, people won't be as suspicious about them. Whereas something like the Abbeville Institute is, well, because it's pro-Southern tradition. Well, that's the antithesis of really good America. That's not good America. Good America is something else. Good America is Lincoln. And I mean, we've seen it over and over again. If you bash Lincoln, you're never a good American. Philip noted that this directly contradicted his father's teachings to say that Lee represented the moral force of half the nation. I have come to watch the Claremont Institute embody the very thing that my father criticized in the conservative movement, Philip Jaffa told me when I spoke with him. This is entirely correct. I think Philip Jaffa is more in line with what Claremont really was, who Harry Jaffa was, than the people at Claremont. But see, they're hanging on to they're hanging on to Lincoln. They're hanging on to Lincoln, and they shouldn't. If they could ditch that, they would be on to something. Some of the most pointed criticisms of Claremont's recent prominence have come from scholars with similar backgrounds. Quote, I think there's a story here about the insularity of the conservative world, says Laura Field, a political philosopher and scholar in residence at American University, who has published several sharp critiques of Claremont over the last year in The Bulwark, a publication started by Never Trump conservatives. Claremont has been, quote, pretty much unchallenged by broader academia, Field told me, as many academics, liberals, but also other conservatives, tend to consider political engagement in general, and Claremont ideas and public manners in particular, beneath them. That's an important line. You see, anybody that's out there doing real work, that's beneath us. I don't want to comment on Claremont. That's beneath us. Or you can say I don't want to comment on the Abbeville Institute. That's beneath us. These people aren't real scholars. They're not academics, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, this is where Claremont always operated on the fringes for years. Of course, you've got Hillsdale College, which, it's Straussian, except for a few good people there. There are some good people at Hillsdale. But, Larry Arnn is a Straussian of the Straussians. He is a Jaffa'ite of the Jaffaites. In contrast, Claremont scholars understand the power of a certain kind of approach to politics that's sensational, she said. Field pointed me to a recent exception, a small panel discussion in July in Washington, in which Kessler took part. Kessler defended the upsurge of populism as pro-constitutional, and so, he said, even though it takes an angry form in many cases, it was difficult to condemn it as simply an eruption of democratic irrationalism. Brian Garston, a political scientist at Yale, responded that it was very generous to interpret the current populism as, quote, erupting in favor of an older understanding of constitutionalism. But even if that was partly true, he questioned whether populism could be, quote, expected to generate a new appreciation for constitutionalism, or whether it wouldn't do just the reverse. It is, Garston said, a dangerous game to try to ride the tiger. Well, isn't this what leftists did for years? I mean, this is what all this bloviating about democracy is, right? Then they talk about, of course, Claremont's budget, which has gone up quite a lot. And then I want to get down to this part where she brings up Jaffa. She says, Harry Jaffa used to ask what it was that American conservatism was conserving. The answer was generally ideological. American conservatism was not about preserving a social structure as in the old European societies, but rather the American idea, a set of principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, that's an important statement, because if you're conserving an idea, you're not a conservative. Again, conservatism is about traditions. It's actually reactionary, right? Conservatism, in so many ways, it's reactionary. It is reacting to the ideas of the other side, to the innovations of the other side that forces you to act. It's reactionary to that. So there is a set of principles behind it. It's not ideas, it's principles based on custom and precedent and tradition that force you to react to the other side. And this culture, these traditional things have culture, right? This is what forms the principles behind the reaction to the ideology. If you say American conservatism is an ideological institution, then it's no different from the left. Ideology is bad. Ideology is at its core reform-minded and leftist. And if you're basing it again on the idea, the propositionation of the Declaration, this is exactly what the piece says, then you're doomed. What appears unsettled at Claremont is the, quote, foggy question of whether or not a republic is too far gone to be conserved. And this is what William Vogelli, the senior editor, wrote in the spring issue. Quote, what would be the bigger mistake to keep fighting to preserve a republic that turns out to be beyond resuscitation, or to give up defending one whose vigor might be yet restored? So he comes down to the side of the central conservative impulse, which is that because valuable things are easy to break but hard to replace, every effort should be made to conserve them while they can be conserved. But he acknowledged that some of his younger colleagues appear ready to, quote, abandon conservatism for a counter-revolution in order to reestablish America's founding principles. Kessler was sanguine. We need a kind of revival of the spirit of constitutionalism, which will then have to be fought out through laws and lawsuits and all the normal daily give and take of politics, he said. That's what I'm in favor of, and it's moving in the right direction. So younger conservatives are to abandon conservatism. Well, they're not abandoning conservatism. They're abandoning ideology, which is what Claremont doesn't get, right? They're abandoning ideology in favor of traditions and trying to settle this in the courts. Or in other ways, right? Voting people out, getting the right people in who have the right traditions for your society. Tom Merrill of American University also studied Jaffa's work and believes there is much in his teachings to appeal to both liberals and conservatives. Aha! Yes, in fact, more liberals than conservatives, because Merrill is actually correct about this. I think the country is so divided right now that if you had a Republican candidate who was like, we messed up in a bunch of ways, we're mostly pretty good, I think that there would be a big middle lane. It would diffuse some of this anger. The American right at present, Merrill argued, was in need of guidance and leadership that did not come from the traditional establishment, which voters had rejected. There is a movement out there that isn't the Republican Party that needs people to speak for and sort of shape the message, he said. In the past, that had meant movement conservatives cordoning off the undemocratic, un-American elements of the far right. Claremont could have filled that role, he argued, but the central challenge facing the right is, can someone take those themes and articulate them in a grown-up way? Some of Claremont have expressed a desire to work with liberals, yet their strategy seems to suggest the opposite. When I asked Williams what Claremont's ideal future would look like, he cited the deconstruction of the administrative state. He told me recently that the June Supreme Court ruling constraining the EPA is a step in the right direction. I agree. And he would like to see Congress get back to the act of legislating. I disagree. Even though I agree that Congress is not doing its job, Congress doesn't need to legislate on a whole bunch of stuff. Instead of delegating rulemaking to bureaucracy, a long-term...
So Brian McClanahan is not a nationalist. He's not a fan of American nationalism because he is such a states' rights federalist bloke. Right? He doesn't want the focus on the United States of America as a unitary entity. He wants the focus on the individual states, allowing for maximum of freedom for California and Arkansas and Arizona and Georgia. So he has a John Calhoun states' rights attitude. I don't think I'm terribly ideological. I'm aware of having a bunch of right-wing instincts, so I don't know as much about history as Brian McClanahan. I don't know as much as any of the people quoted in that New York Times article about the Claremont Institute. So I'm quite happy with American nationalism. I recognize the case to be made for states' rights, but I just don't think it's doable right now. So I think that the best thing that we can do to make our country a little better is to become a little bit more nationalist. So I'm broadly sympathetic to Donald Trump's program. I'm broadly sympathetic to MAGA, and I'm broadly sympathetic to right-wing impulses to, for example, more severely punish violent criminals than left-wing impulses. I am more sympathetic to right-wing impulses to limit immigration, to put American nationalist interests first rather than the interests of groups on the other side of the world. So we have genetic predispositions, not just to behavior and not just to a personality that is either outgoing or introverted. We also have genetic predispositions towards political impulses. And then we can build ideologies about those impulses. But the ideologies are just another layer built upon our predispositions. And so often we can have impulses that will serve us better than more thought-through, rationalized responses. So you may have an impulse that this person is dangerous, even though you can't articulate it. Or you may believe that God loves you, even though you can't necessarily provide a strong rational or empirical case for that. So there are all sorts of beliefs that we have that you may not be terribly skilled at articulating, but they serve you. And we also have all sorts of emotions and impulses that we may not be able to rationalize and make a strong philosophical case for following, and yet following these emotions, following these predispositions, following these instincts, right, they serve us, and they often serve us better than the most profound philosophies. So we see these predispositions down through history, right? So the political left down through history tends to support equality. It is way more open to novel ways of doing things. The right down through history tends to support authority, hierarchy, order, and the traditional way of doing things. And even though my predispositions are right-wing, I recognize that the world outside of me is far more complicated than I can possibly comprehend, and that there are going to be situations that come along where a left-wing impulse will serve you better than a right-wing impulse. That in some situations, the United States may be better served by becoming an empire, and in other situations, it will be better served by withdrawing from empire, perhaps withdrawing from the NATO treaty and becoming much more isolationist. Right? So some situations, strict hierarchical decision-making will better serve you. Other situations, egalitarian arrangements will serve you much better. Probably wondering, 40, what amazing bookmarks you have on the platform X to share with us. I am so glad that you asked. Okay, The Spectator, which is center-right publication out of the United Kingdom, has an essay here, The Dumbing Down of Oxford and Cambridge. The notion that Oxbridge's standards need to be lowered to benefit students from our multiracial inner cities is perverse, given low standards are what failed so many of these kids in the first place. Aha. I didn't know this.
About 10 years ago, it sounds about right time-wise, one of my brothers was having a birthday party, and my stepmother was there, who was obviously married to my mother, not my real mother, but my stepmother.
Who was married to your father.
Yes, but who I grew up with.
Right.
And my stepmother said to me, "Do you know who Bill Burr is?" Now, at that point, I'd never heard of Bill Burr. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he was a comedian or he could have been the guy down the street.
Right.
And she said, "Well, he's this comedian, da-da-da." And I think I even somehow called up a picture on a phone, and I kind of noticed right away, like, gee, he really looks like my father. Bill Burr looks more like my father than Bill Burr looks like me, or I look like Bill Burr. So I said to my mother, like, well, why are you asking me this? You know, I thought maybe at the first thing she was just going to say, oh, I just thought you noticed the resemblance. She goes, I think it might be one of your father's illegitimate children. Bill Burr might be one of the children that your father sired in his days on being a traveling musician.
Sit down.
You're an asshole.
Billy Corgan. Billy Corgan. Yeah. I'm an asshole? Yeah, I thought this would be great to bring a family together.
He didn't tell you. He told me you were totally cool with me coming.
That's what he does. That's what he does.
I thought it would be a good surprise.
Can this be edited out or no?
I can go. I mean, you told me Bill was.
All right, fuck it. No, I'll do it. Did you ever think the fact that I never told that story, that maybe you shouldn't? Did you ever? You know how many fucking emails and crap that I got? I sort of went away from that.
So let me just fill in. Let me just fill in.
Do we talk on a regular basis?
We've never met.
So Billy Corgan was nice enough on my podcast to talk about the fact that he told a story that he had never told before, that his father traveled.
My stepmother said to me, do you know who Bill Burr is? Bill Burr might be one of the children that your father sired in his days on being a traveling musician.
If you do the math.
He was a piece of shit. And he had two kids this close together, and he named them the same fucking name. He thinks it's different because he's Billy and I'm Bill. That's how he told the difference.
Well, I was Bill when I was young. But you're right. I mean, with all respect.
I just thought.
Whatever. It's not that I don't like him. It reminds me of all of that shit. So,
it just seems more of the same from what I've been hearing.
All right, whatever. I mean, I like your music.
Appreciate that.
Okay, great.
Would you? Oh, you know what would be cool if you let your brother play drums.
You can do whatever you want because you kind of already did that.
Okay, I'm trying to be respectful.
Now you are.
Okay, no, wait. He told me you were cool with me.
You're a Cubs fan? That fucking tracks.
Theo Epstein.
Fucking Wrigleyville. Bunch of cunts. Southside's where it's at. What's up?
Do you want me to tell the story?
Yes.
Okay. So, he owns about 80 buildings in this area. I don't know if you know how rich he is. But anyway, so I was working in another building of his, and I came out the building, and the first thing he said to me was, here comes Bill Burr. And I said, do you know that story somehow? He said, what story? So I told him privately that story. Mm-hmm. He said, oh, you got to say this if you know how rich he is. But
he
anyway,
always does
so
that.
I was working in another building, and I came out the building, and the first thing he said to me was, here comes Bill
we
Burr.
Went through growing up. He's getting hit just for the fucking
do you know
ratings.
that story?
I mean, the guy literally accepted a fucking award in the middle of a podcast.
So I told him privately that
I'm supposed to be promoting my special, and he's over here
You can do it. March 14th on Hulu.
That's going to help now?
I still love you, though. Even though you did
But
this.
it's not about
Okay,
me.
so now what was supposed to happen? Are we going to go play catch? We're both in our 50s.
Okay, that's an amazing story. All right, I'm glad that they came together. All right, what other amazing bookmarks do I have lined up to share? Donald Trump roasts Joe Biden. This is funny.
Our country was on the verge of some of the very bad things, and bad things were happening. And now there's light not only over America. I've heard it from even our enemies. They call up and they say, sir, we hate you. We do hate you, but there's light over the world right now. They hate me. Some of them hate me. If they liked me, you got a problem, right? They like Sleepy Joe. What's not to like? They'd call up. It's funny. I was told today by one of the big leaders of the world, would call for a telephone call with the President of the United States a year ago. And they'd say, we'd like to speak with, who is this? It's the head of Germany, the head of, name it, the head of France, the name of any country, it didn't matter. He would never pick up the call. They'd say, he'll call you back in 2 months. 2 months. Yes, his schedule. He's extremely busy sleeping. No. Macron of France, he'll call you back in 2 months. So 2 months comes along and there's no call. They say, he didn't call. The stories are, I mean, these stories are not very exaggerated. I want to tell you, they're a little bit for laughter, but, you know, it's only for laughter. The fake news will say, oh, he exaggerated. It was only 1 month, you know. But he'll say he'll call you back, and then he'd never call, and then they could never get him on the phone. And the problem I have is that when I speak to and I speak to them immediately, they'll say, could we speak to the president? Would that be possible? We could do it anytime over the next month. They're so used to this, right? I say, no, I'll pick it up right now. Is he on the phone? Yeah, hello, how you doing? That's what, you know, get it over with, right? Get it over with. The only problem, they were so starved for love from the United States, I cannot get them off the phone. I can't get people, if you can't, I say, I have to go now, King, or I have to go now, President. But you can't get them off the phone. They're starved for love. You know, for years they haven't spoken. They didn't even know we had a president, if you want to know. But under our leadership, America is back open.
Okay, Donald Trump showing a great deal of self-awareness. Pretty good little clip. Okay, what other amazing insights do I have? So the most prestigious columnist in the world today is Janan Ganesh. He writes for the Financial Times. I spend $180 a year for a subscription to the Financial Times, in part to read his columns. And says the first lesson in politics before Donald Trump was message discipline. Come with a rote phrase such as, we're all in this together, and prepare to repeat it regardless of context. So, if nothing else, the rise of Donald Trump has exposed a widespread public fed-upness with uniformity and standardization. And is this same revolt spreading to other fields? Take the media. Why do podcasts do so well? Because in the end, they are messy, elliptical, digressive, everything else that broadcast theory abhors. Right, in the case of Joe Rogan, there can't be much difference between his on-air and off-air speech. The tight professionalism of linear radio is, for millions of us who are raised on it, unlistenable in comparison. Even the world's favorite sport, soccer, right, so long in the intellectual grip of the micromanaging perfectionist Pep Guardiola, might be loosening up. Right? Manchester City, coached by Pep, has been struggling the past few months. Right, the much freer Liverpool Football Club are thriving with a not obviously better squad. Right, if Liverpool clinch the Premier League, right, perhaps the era of overcoaching, the bane of modern fans, might recede. So years ago, there was a column this guy wrote called The Death of the Maverick. The argument was, in most industries, there's now so much data about what works that everyone converges on the same way of doing things. Songwriters know how to put a hook in the first 30 seconds to keep Spotify listeners from skipping a track. New build apartments have the same kitchen lounge plan. Soccer has become rigid. Watching Trump's distressingly effective inaugural speech, I nursed one consolation. His success sends a signal to other overmanaged sectors. There are rewards for deviating from strict form. I'm writing this in Los Angeles, where I once lived. It has no dominant architectural style, right? Unlike Jerusalem, there's one dominant architectural style using Jerusalem stone. Los Angeles has no obvious center, right? A bleak strip mall might contain a jewel of a restaurant or gallery. It is LA's lack of pattern. It's more like life. It's more like the flux of experience and reality. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, various geniuses submitted plans to rebuild London from first principles. Many wanted to bring Euclidean order to the labyrinth. Their designs, full of right angles and other atrocities, got nowhere. Otherwise, London would now be a ghastly grid. Well, LA and London, right, these are both the least designed of the great Western cities. There's just something in the human id that chafes against structure and regimentation. I had not thought of that. All right, this bloke, he got into West Coast Straussianism.
That I got into West Coast Straussianism. Right? And to be honest, it's quite an improbable thing to get into West Coast Straussianism, especially if you're like me and you didn't go to college, or rather, you started to go to college but you thought it was silly. So, laugh out loud. I know most viewers won't know what West Coast Straussianism is, or rather, maybe only people who have some idea would click on this video, but you know what I mean. So, real quick, I'll explain what it is. Now, in general, Straussianism, I characterize as the belief that #ancient Greek lives matter, right? Or it's the idea that classical thought is superior to modern thought, right? Now, these are just going to be real quick descriptions. Should be discussed at length. This is just real quick. Now, there's the crisis of the Strauss divided, right? There's the East Coast, West Coast split, right? So East Coast Straussians believe that America is a product of modern thought. And, so they infer that America is low and base, right?
So this video was published 7 years ago.
Because classical thought is what is superior. But West Coast Straussians believe that America is, in fact, a product of classical thought, right? And I'm a West Coast Straussian. So classical thought, for me anyway, and I think this is a fair statement, especially revolves around Plato and Aristotle. And I had tried to get into Plato when I was young, and I failed. Right? I tried to read the Republic, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is brutal. Right? I can't do this. I think I finished book 1, and I put it away. Right? And the reason for this especially was because I was into Mark Levin, the radio host. Right? I still like Mark Levin. I wish he would just Strauss it up already. But at the time, my favorite book on philosophy was his book, Meritopia. I still like that book. Don't get me wrong. But it has like a Karl Popper-esque analysis of the Republic. Right? So, in other words, it presents Plato in a certain way as a totalitarian, right? As someone that, like why would you consider Plato other than to understand totalitarianism? So anyway, I have this friend. Here's where the story begins about how I got into West Coast Straussianism. I have a friend, Nick, right? And he's like a heavy metal guitar player, and the way that I put him is that he believes that Yngwie Malmsteen leads a sort of ideal life, right? It's sort of an exaggeration of what Nick is like, but I'll let you see the context here. It's a nice little speech by this really old man, Harry Jaffa. He's like the oldest man you'll ever see have a serious conversation. Play clip 1.
And I have to say that I'm especially honored that we're joined by one of our nation's greatest thinkers and scholars, Dr. Harry Jaffa.
So, anyway, I watched this and figured Ted Cruz thinks this is one of our nation's greatest thinkers and scholars. And I've never heard of him. Harry Jaffa, right? I at least got Harry Jaffa. He's like the oldest man you'll ever see have a serious conversation. Play clip 2.
In 1946, I was in a used bookstore on 4th Avenue in New York when I was a graduate student at the New School and I was studying with Strauss. And I happened to pick up a copy of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It was my custom in those days, if I found a book in the bookstore that I liked, I'd come back each day to read some more of it, since I didn't have any money. But I somehow scraped up $5 to pay for this copy of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I had taken no courses in American history, either as an undergraduate or as a graduate student. But I fell in love with the debates just because it was such wonderful reading. And it occurred to me.
So it was the language. The first point of contact was the power of the language?
Well, I saw that there was something classical. I was studying with Strauss, and I didn't see this right away, but I did after a while, that the issue between Lincoln and Douglas was not similar to, but identical to the difference between Socrates and Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic. This question of whether or not the people make the moral law or the moral law makes the people. Thrasymachus says justice is the interest of the stronger, which in a democracy means justice is whatever the demos, the many, were. In a tyranny, it's whatever the tyrant wants to do. In an oligarchy, it's whatever the rich want to do. But there was no idea of any law controlling the decision of the people who made these decisions. Stephen A. Douglas's position was that he let the people rule.
So
Paul Godfrey absolutely loathes that man, Harry Jaffa. And so the West Coast Straussians, they revere Abraham Lincoln and they revere strong unitary government. They revere a strong unitary government that forces all sorts of restrictions on states' rights. So Paul Gottfried would be more in line with Brian McClanahan, more favorable towards states' rights and less enthusiastic about Abraham Lincoln. And the chat note, San Francisco is a grid. It was the 1906 earthquake and fire that broke the East Coast banks that caused the Federal Reserve to be conceived. Okay, this is a great story. Left-wing, angry, and fictitious. Fake harassment claim shakes German Greens. So what's useful to understand is what's the structure? What are the set of incentives that made something so ludicrous take place? So Stefan Gelbach was forced to step down from an election race following allegations from a non-existent woman. Right? How pathetic are Germany's Greens, and how pathetic is German culture and politics and journalism that this occurred. Germany's Greens have been rocked by a scandal involving a woman who did not exist. Stefan Gelbach, a member of parliament from Berlin, was forced in December to withdraw from running for next month's federal elections after he faced accusations of sexual harassment. So the Biden administration put into place requirements that severely limit the rights of those accused of sexual misbehavior on college campuses. So the Trump regime reinstates the rights of those accused. So this guy, he was ruined by accusations of sexual harassment from a woman who did not exist. So there is a particular attitude and culture and regime that so believe women that they are quite willing to ruin a man's life based upon accusations from a woman who does not exist. Right? Stefan protested his innocence, but he bowed to internal pressure to withdraw from the party's list of candidates, bringing his political career to a swift and inglorious end. But in a twist, the 48-year-old has emerged as an apparent victim of green-on-green skullduggery. The public broadcaster that first went public with the claims against him has admitted that the most serious accusation appeared to have come from someone who did not exist, who was a fake persona invented by a local Green official who on social media describes herself as autistic, left-wing, and chronically angry. And sad, this case has caused despair among women's rights campaigners who warn that the case undermines the credibility of real victims of sexual harassment. And it has been met with thinly veiled glee from political rivals who have long been rubbed up by what they see as the Greens' unbearable smugness. What an amazing story.
Brother, or whatever you want to say, of emotivism, right? So presentism is an emotional way of looking at the past. It's based on preconceived modern notions of moral questions and applying them to the past because these make you feel better. And the right is just as guilty of this as the left, particularly the modern Straussians, the West Coast Straussians, the neoconservatives, and even if you might argue, and Jesse Merriam does in this piece, the new right, right? So I want to get into this because he talks about Hazony and also Adrian Vermeule, who is also a big intellectual figure now in the right. And this is a review of both of their work, and the title is Much to Spew About Nothing. Much to Spew About Nothing. And it gets into this position where their major attack on emotivism or these other things is, or I should say originalism, is false. I mean, it's leading you down the wrong path. And so I want to read this because it's really good, and I think you're going to get something out of it too. So he says, the 2016 populist uprising against establishment conservatism generated an important shift in scholarly discourse on the conservative movement. A shift from whether the movement is succeeding to why it has failed. Now, that is an important point to make. The left seems to be winning all the time. So we're not talking about whether we're succeeding, but why we're failing. And so what is the root cause of that? Why are conservatives not being successful? This is the same question that Harry Jaffa essentially was asking in the 1970s when he postulated that equality is conservative. And I'll talk about equality coming up. I've got an article I want to go through with that too. But you see, Jaffa believed that conservatives were failing because the left had monopolized this term equality and weaponized it and used it to their advantage, really since Lincoln. But he didn't think that was leftist. He thought that was actually conservative, that Lincoln was a conservative. And so therefore, American equality is conservative. The Lincolnian view of America was conservative, not leftist. And essentially the idea was to take race off the table because of the emotional response to that particular issue. It's not logical. Attacking Confederate monuments, for example, or Confederate symbols is not logical. It's emotional. It's emotivism on display on a regular basis. That monument, the symbols, had nothing to do with anything. Right? They had nothing to do with anything that we've talked about in the last, say, decade. But because there is a powerful emotional response for some people, not a logical response, but an emotional response, it merits the discussion of taking these things down, which really solves nothing. I mean, has crime gotten any better? Well, no. Have policies gotten any better? Well, no. Has government gotten any better? No. Has the economy gotten any better? No. But we took down those monuments. You see, this is the emotional response. It means nothing. And so this is what Jaffa was trying to do. Well, we solve this emotional problem, and now we start talking about things logically. It becomes rational. All our discussions are rational. What they're missing is that at its core, in reality, modern leftism can never really be rational. It's almost always emotional. And that's a powerful thing. I mean, I'm not discounting this, how powerful that is. And what Trump started doing and what the right started doing in 2016 was using that to their advantage, too. They're making emotional arguments. And it's not always a negative emotion. Sometimes it's a positive emotion. Sometimes it's laughing. Sometimes it's picking on the other side and making people laugh. That's an emotional response. Not logical, but emotional. And so Trump's willingness to go on the offensive on Twitter, for example, was funny. Right? It's funny. And so people gravitated towards that. It became an emotional response. So discussing why we're failing is a really interesting topic. As a result of this shift, a new scholarly industry has emerged around the following question. Why had the conservative movement, despite its institutional growth and the Republican Party's electoral success, managed to conserve so little of the American way of life? Why is it not conserving anything, really? Well, I think the answer is clearly emotion. Because when you talk about the old way of the American way of life, right, this is a traditional position. Some of that is related to logic. When you start talking about fences, right, this is Chesterton's fence. You have a fence put up. It's there because of things that were done over time that proved the fence was necessary. But the emotional response is, I don't like the fence. The fence is doing something to harm me for whatever reason, at least rhetorically or emotionally. And so the fence has to be taken down. Not understanding the consequences of it. Not really caring about the consequences of it. The fence comes down, so what? We'll deal with the consequences later. And so conservatives fall in this trap too. They don't want to be bad guys. They don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. They don't want to do these things, right? We're dealing with toddlers in a lot of cases. You know, your toddler cries and throws a temper tantrum. Well, okay, you kind of give in and give them the toy. You just want them to stop crying. Well, that's exactly what's happened. You have people that are emotionally responding, like a toddler, to things that they shouldn't really respond to. And the right has just given in. They've taken up the fence. That's what happens. So he says, two scholars in particular, Adrian Vermeule and Yoram Hazony, have made new careers out of this question. Before the 2016 shift, both men were accomplished thinkers in their respective fields, but neither played a significant role in conservative discourse. Vermeule, a Harvard Law School professor, focused on executive power and administrative law, and Hazony, president of the Herzl Institute, wrote primarily on Israel and Zionism. Over the last several years, however, Vermeule and Hazony have become significant and arguably the most significant public intellectuals in the so-called New Right, with Vermeule leading the conservative movement against originalism and Hazony heading the controversial National Conservatism Conference. Their most recent books, Vermeule's Common Good Constitutionalism and Hazony's Conservatism, a Rediscovery, published within just a few months of each other, present their most sustained search for a solution to the failures of American conservatism. Now, I've talked about Common Good Constitutionalism on this podcast, and I've talked about Conservatism, a Rediscovery on this podcast, but I thought that this was a nice summary of these two things and why there's a problem with them. And there's a problem with both, particularly when you're talking about conserving anything in American society, because it operates from a position, both of them do, that the center, the nation state, the United States, is supreme, right? And there is a national American culture, which has never been true. They're ignoring all the arguments against centralized power that were issued in the early 19th century, not by leftists, but by conservatives. John Taylor of Caroline was not a leftist. He was a conservative. John Randolph of Roanoke was not a leftist. He was conservative. John C. Calhoun was not a leftist. He was a conservative. You see, there's a problem with these people. And if you don't know what it is, it begins with an S and ends with a Y. Right? So see, it's an emotional response to these individuals, not a logical response, but an emotional response. We don't live in their America, but yet we can still learn from their positions. Thankfully, we don't live in a period of time where we have slavery, right? That's gone. But they still had a lot of valuable things to say about American society, what America was, what the founding meant, what American government was, and why it was important to have federalism, which, of course, is the core of originalism. Anyways. So Merriam says, both books have been reviewed in Law and Liberty Symposia, so I will not be analyzing the books in depth here. Instead, I will be discussing how much these works have in common, both in terms of the problems they diagnose and the solutions they offer. Okay, so that's good. He's not going to focus on the books, but the two men and their solutions and how these are highly troubling or problematic for conservatism. We'll use that term, problematic, which is an academic term now. On the surface, Vermeule and Hazony have almost nothing in common. Vermeule is a recent Catholic convert, rejects any affiliation with political conservatism, and specializes in legal theory and administrative law. Hazony is an Israeli Orthodox Jew, has been an active participant in conservative politics, and is a political philosopher by training. Nevertheless, the recent books offer strikingly similar explanations of what is causing American political and social dysfunction.
So, God forbid there's a comment in the chat, press F for slavery. Now, no matter how much you viscerally, emotionally, and morally hate slavery, I would think it would be worth considering what are the particular circumstances that gave rise to certain groups enslaving other groups, right? There are certain economies. There are certain situations in life where it seemed at the time that bringing in slaves was a great idea. For example, something about sugarcane or certain agricultural products that were developed in the South, such as cotton, that were apparently particularly suited for slavery, while there are other forms of economic communities where slavery was not a good fit. So slavery was not present in the northern United States in the first half of the 19th century, to the best of my knowledge, or it wasn't important because the economy in the North was not benefited by having slaves. So even if you hate ethnic cleansing and genocide, it's worth asking what are the situations that make ethnic cleansing and genocide more likely to occur? When do powerful groups feel incentivized to enslave? When do powerful groups feel incentivized to engage in ethnic cleansing or genocide? For example, when you have two groups who hate each other fighting over one particular spot of land, such as the conflict between Jews and Palestinians, right? That kind of conflict tends to lead and tends to incentivize ethnic cleansing, if not genocide. So the South didn't adopt slavery, and the North didn't refuse slavery because the North was just so much more moral than the South, right? There were different economic incentives that were operating. So there may well have been substantial moral sentiments that prevented slavery in the North and a lack of moral clarity that enabled slavery in the South. But there were also economic incentives operating. Different industries require incentivize slavery at certain times and places, and other industries and systems of economics discourage slavery. So, to the best of my knowledge, every rabbi in the South prior to the Civil War who spoke about slavery did not criticize the institution of slavery.
For both authors, the problem stems from our commitments to individual rights and disaggregated governance, and that these commitments work together in preventing us from making national policy on the basis of the common good. So what he's saying here, of course, is individual rights, individual liberty, which, of course, is a particular strain of American culture, generally coming from the South, and disaggregated governance, which is, of course, decentralization, make it hard to have a common good. That's the problem. The belief in individual rights and decentralized government is a problem. We need more centralization, and we need to have less influence. We need to have essentially the Puritan version of America, right? which is the good of the community over individual, or community liberty over individual liberty, right? So, I mean, this is the point. Individual liberty, not so much. Community liberty, yes. It's a Puritan view of America. So they've latched on to this Puritan view of America, which was another strain of Americanism, right? So you have this New England view of America in contrast to a Southern view of America, if you want to put it in simple terms. And that's essentially what we're looking at here. And to them, Puritan New England is more conservative than the South. In fact, the South wasn't really conservative at all because of slavery.
So if you're a decent person, you're enslaved to something. So, for example, if you've recovered from under-earning, you're likely enslaved to a particular way of life. The 12-step big book approach to life, to tracking your time, to being aware of the symptoms of under-earning, to working with other under-earners, right? This is a type of bondage that enables one to overcome the despair that comes with under-earning. If you have recovered from debting, you're likely in bondage to a particular way of life tied to the big book and to tracking everything you earn, everything you spend, a particular way of life that will usually require working with other people who are trying to recover from debting. So every good man is enslaved to somebody or something. If you are a Christian, right, you're enslaved to the burden of the kingdom of heaven and to the requirements of leading a Christ-like life or the requirements of the Roman Catholic Church. If you are a traditional Jew, you are enslaved to the kingdom of heaven and to the particular expression of the traditional way of life as laid out in Jewish law, otherwise known as halakha. If you're a good man, you have substantial obligations to your spouse, to your family, your extended family, to your employer, to your employees, to your community, to your profession. Right? All good men and women are slaves to other people and to other things. There is no escaping slavery. Right? But what are you enslaved to? One of the worst forms of slavery is being enslaved to your own self-destructive impulses. Now, being enslaved like blacks were in the South prior to the Civil War is not a type of life that I would ever want, or that I think that anyone listening to this would ever want. But on average, blacks in the South who were enslaved prior to the Civil War often had longer lifespans than some whites in Europe. Now, does that mean that their life of slavery was better than those whites who were not slaves in Europe but who had a shorter lifespan? No, but it is a consideration. Right? The harshness of slavery depended on the slaveholder. Right? Some slaveholders were horrible to their slaves. Others were quite generous to their slaves. And after the Civil War and after the end of slavery, right, that came with many problems. Right? So in the South, right, there developed relations between blacks and whites where each side knew the other fairly intimately, and there were all sorts of strictures and rules that discouraged mixing. There were the Jim Crow traditions, for example. In the North, there were far fewer formal rules against mixing whites and blacks, but overall, whites and blacks in the North led as separate lives as possible. So simply ending slavery is obviously just not some one-size-fits-all automatic improvement in the lives of the enslaved. I would suspect that I would hope that the overwhelming majority of slaves who were freed went on to higher quality lives than they had when they were slaves. But for some people, I would expect that such a transition was jarring and frightening and anxiety-producing.
Right? This goes back to Jaffa. Jaffa said slavery was not conservative. Equality was conservative. Okay? So but Calhoun stands up and says he's a conservative. The radical Republicans called the Northern Democrats conservatives. So what are we talking about here? You're saying that people weren't conservative, that would never classify themselves as conservative, are now conservatives, and the people that did classify themselves as conservatives are no longer conservative. because somehow Lincoln's view of America is conservative because it attaches to Jefferson's line, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We hold to the proposition of this, right? So you skip over that that's somehow conservative and this other stuff isn't, right? So again, the thorny issue for that.
So I'm reading a terrific book. I'm rereading it, The Most Powerful Court in the World. It's the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's excellent in that it tries to understand various members of the Supreme Court and their rulings in their particular context. What were the incentives that they faced? So you may be appalled, ashamed, filled with loathing and contempt for some of the historical rulings of the Supreme Court, but it's worth understanding the Supreme Court at its particular time, in its particular context. When I look back on my life and see many things that I've said and done, I feel ashamed. I feel embarrassed. I don't want you to know about it. But at the time, I was doing the best I could with the tools that I had at my availability. I was reacting to the forces that were driving me and the incentives around me. So I find if I want to understand, I have to let go of the need to judge. And when I'm in simply a state of awareness, that I tend to carry with me considerably reduced levels of muscular tension, that I have much more freedom in my movement, in my breathing, that I tend to operate more effectively and efficiently. So the NFC Championship is about to start, and so I must say goodbye. Bye-bye.